Shiryu's livestream in the mountains was supposed to be a huge scientific success until reality completely glitched out. As he was proving to his skeptical viewers that the scenery was real, a runaway truck came blasting out of a tunnel, barreling straight toward him and about to crush him live on camera. What should have been a televised tragedy turned into something straight out of a game bug. A bluish light swallowed the truck. Space shattered like glass, and the young man's body dissolved into pure computer code. When he came to, the fresh mountain breeze had been replaced by the stench of a rotting dungeon. Sitting on a glowing magic circle etched into the floor, the streamer found himself locked inside a filthy prison cell, surrounded by the delirious screams of other inmates. Gripping the rusted bars while rats scurried through the darkness, he desperately searched for some logical explanation for this insane teleportation, but science had no answers this time. The sound of heavy boots dragging chains snapped him out of his thoughts, but what truly caught his attention inside the cell was a tiny figure lying in the dirt. It was a white-haired girl, covered in chains and giving off only the faintest trace of magical energy. Amid all the panic and horror, the young prisoner's unshakable calm was the strangest part of the nightmare. Mesmerized by the girl's almost unreal appearance, the young man asked what kind of atrocity had landed her in a place like this. Intrigued by the stranger's courage, she explained that her sentence came from a curse she'd been born with. While he struggled to make sense of any of it, thinking she should have been the one freaking out over his bizarre appearance, the girl dropped the truth. They were sitting on death row. Without sugarcoating anything, she admitted that his presence there was the result of a failed ritual to summon a demon. The protagonist was ready to write her off as insane until she revealed the worst part. The very next morning, they were both going to be burned alive at the stake. The sorceress even offered to undo the summoning spell and send him back home, but with one brutal warning. He'd return directly beneath the wheels of the truck that had killed him. The realization hit him instantly. Science didn't lie, and getting hit by that truck in his original world would have definitely been fatal, proving that the nightmare of burning at the stake was now his one and only reality. Meeting the sharp gaze of his cellmate, who was watching to see if panic had finally set in, he flashed a confident smile. Unfazed by death, the science streamer declared that his only true fear was ignorance, promising to use everything he knew to engineer an escape from the seemingly inescapable prison. The prisoner had already accepted her tragic fate, convinced there was no possible way out, but the loud hiss of melting metal snapped her back to reality. Her eyes went wide as she watched the outsider turn the thick iron bars into glowing pools of molten metal. How could he destroy a material immune to magic without releasing even a trace of mystical energy? To her, the only possible explanation was an incredibly high-level fire spell. Interrupting the girl's amazement, the young man denied having any supernatural powers. There was no magic involved at all, just the pure application of chemistry. Digging through his backpack, he pulled out a toolkit that looked completely alien in this world. Proud of his gear, the boy began explaining the concept of a thermite reaction to someone who had never even heard the word science. Without wasting a second, he prepared the exact mixture and flicked a lighter. The spark generated an intense burst of heat that shattered the girl's chains in moments, slicing through the steel with ease. As she stood there in shock, trying to figure out whether the man was actually human or some bizarre glitch in the laws of the universe, the outsider simply flashed a confident smile and reached out his hand to pull her out of that hell. Wasting no time, he grabbed her by the arm, determined to get her out of that pit of despair. Hesitant and consumed by guilt, the prisoner warned that saving her would be a fatal mistake, insisting that her very existence only brought disaster. Focused solely on escaping, the outsider completely ignored the superstition, trusting only what he could see and prove. Impressed by the boy's stubborn skepticism, she finally whispered her name, Rina. He introduced himself in return as they moved through the shadows, but their stealthy escape was instantly shattered by the blare of an alarm. Within seconds, dozens of soldiers carrying torches blocked their path. Panic spread through the guards the moment they recognized the young woman as the dreaded demon of calamity. Without backing down, Rina stepped to the front. A crushing aura cracked the stone floor as she opened a teleportation circle beneath their feet. The pair was swallowed by a brilliant flash of energy and launched straight into the night sky. But their relief quickly turned into despair. As they plummeted through the air at terrifying speed, the sorceress completely ran out of magic. The spell keeping them afloat collapsed, sending both of them hurtling toward the dark forest below. As they fell toward the ground, the sorceress accepted her fate with unsettling calm, ready for the worst. Without thinking twice, the young man threw himself between her and the ground, wrapping his arms around her in midair and using his own body to absorb the entire impact. The brutal landing left him battered and covered in bruises, But the girl stood up completely unharmed, coldly informing him that they were finally safe. Ignoring her complete lack of sympathy, the streamer looked around and realized their disastrous landing had dropped them into an abandoned graveyard on the outskirts of the city. Laughing at his own misfortune, he joked that he wished he'd had a camera to record their epic escape, claiming the video would have broken the internet. The lighthearted mood disappeared when he demanded to know their next move. Standing before an ancient gravestone, the girl crushed any hope of freedom. Under the absolute laws of summoning, the protagonist was now her mystical beast and was required to stay by her side at all times. She even went as far as threatening to put a muzzle on him if he stepped out of line or disobeyed her. Becoming the pet of an apparently unstable mage was already absurd enough, but the real bombshell came next. Their lives were now linked. If the girl died, he'd be buried alongside her in the very same instant. Panic hit him hard. With her magic completely drained, the two of them had no way to defend themselves, and death seemed almost inevitable. Refusing to accept that fate without a fight, the science streamer grabbed her wrist firmly, demanding her full attention as he searched for a way to turn things around. Looking at the deadly bond that connected them, the young man declared that the sorceress's life now belonged to him as well. Determined, he promised to protect her and make sure she returned home safely, brushing aside her cold reminder that the heavily fortified exit was under constant guard. The next morning, disguised beneath heavy cloaks, the pair slipped into a settlement filled with medieval-style architecture. His companion immediately warned him that all magic was strictly forbidden within the city's streets. Watching the people around him, the outsider noticed a bizarre social structure. Every armed patrol was made up entirely of female warriors, while the men were left doing all the hard labor. The young woman explained the hierarchy, revealing that magical abilities belonged exclusively to women, forcing men into complete submission. The news hit the streamer like a truck. Not only was he already a wanted man, but he also had to deal with being considered a second-class human at the very bottom of society. Their tense walk came to a halt when they ran into a group of workers dragging the monstrous corpse of a shadow wolf. When the bucket serving as the beast's muzzle fell off, the danger became immediately obvious. Its drool melted the ground like butter. While the girl warned that even a single drop on human skin would cause unbearable pain, the science streamer's eyes lit up. He identified the deadly secretion as pure sulfuric acid. Rambling excitedly about magnesium reactions and chemical displacement to townspeople who couldn't understand a single word he was saying, he removed the creature's bladder and tucked it away. It was the perfect container for carrying his new corrosive weapon, completely ignoring his companion's tense warnings that guards were patrolling nearby. The final obstacle was the city's fortified gate. Getting past that heavily guarded checkpoint was the only way to take Rina home, no matter what it took. Without wasting any time, the young man started mixing chemical compounds, leaving the girl completely confused. He trapped the foul-smelling gas produced by the reaction pure hydrogen inside the shadow wolf's bladder and an improvised container, using scraps of cloth from his backpack as makeshift fuses. After placing the device in a strategic, isolated location, he lit the cloth with his lighter. The flame raced along the fuse, and the explosion was devastating. The deafening blast shattered the windows of nearby buildings, spreading chaos and absolute panic through the streets. At the watchtower, the alarm sounded immediately, and the guards instantly blamed the attack on the Witch of Calamity. As the captain ordered a full mobilization of the troops to stop the supposed assault, the fugitives seized the perfect distraction. Carrying the mage on his back, the streamer sprinted toward the city gate, proving the effectiveness of science once again. As the castle walls disappeared behind them, the young woman finally believed she was truly going home. Amazed by the unbelievable power of her summoned companion, she hugged him tightly. Meanwhile, hidden within the city's chaos, a mysterious figure watched everything unfold. The dust from the explosion had barely settled when a mysterious blonde woman appeared. She looked almost identical to Rina, wearing nearly the same outfit. Fixing her eyes on the unusual creature her rival had summoned, greed filled her heart, and she decided she would capture it no matter the cost. Without hesitation, she unleashed a pack of magical beasts to begin the hunt. The monster's keen senses led the squad of warriors to the entrance of a dark cave. The captain immediately ordered his troops inside, while the blonde woman confidently waited outside. What the pursuers didn't realize was that the tables had already turned. An unbearable stench filled the cave, overwhelming the beast's powerful sense of smell and forcing the entire squad to retreat. Far away, Shiryu and Rina continued their journey in complete safety. The young man explained his strategy, spreading a scent so overpowering that it completely erased the enemy's ability to track them. It was a brilliant move that only worked because of the valuable information Rina had shared about the creature's weaknesses. The peaceful moment didn't last long. Rina suddenly grabbed the boy's arm and leaned in to sniff him. She realized the horrible odor they had used to escape had also soaked into their clothes. The moment he mentioned they needed to clean themselves up, the girl took matters into her own hands in the most aggressive way possible. Using her elemental powers, she trapped her partner inside a giant floating sphere of water, forcing him to take an instant magical bath right there in the middle of nowhere. The unexpected bath left the young man completely stunned. As they resumed their walk across the dry, barren landscape, he was still trying to recover from the shock. Meanwhile, Rina walked beside him as if nothing unusual had happened, happily pointing out how wonderful it felt to be clean again. The young man begged her never to surprise him with another water attack like that. Being stripped down in the middle of nowhere had completely embarrassed him, and he worried his reputation would have been ruined if anyone had seen it. Not understanding the problem at all, the mage simply replied that she had only granted his request for a bath. To lighten the mood, she pointed toward the horizon, where a small village stood, insisting it would be the perfect place to relax. Reality, however, hit them hard. When they arrived, they found what was practically a ghost town. The eerie silence was finally broken when they saw two elderly villagers desperately fighting over a few drops of water from a dried-up well. The heartbreaking scene made it clear that the lively village Rina remembered no longer existed. Studying the situation, the protagonist quickly came up with an idea: use Rina's magic to replenish the village's water supply. The witch immediately agreed and began gathering her magical energy. A crystal-clear sphere formed in her hand, catching the attention of the villagers, who instantly stopped fighting. Moments later, she released a massive torrent of water, pouring it directly into the empty well. Within seconds, the reservoir overflowed. Amazed by what they believed was a miracle, the villagers dropped to their knees and begged the young woman to save them. Looking around, the young man finally understood the full extent of the disaster. Dead crops, cracked earth, and people fighting over muddy puddles made it painfully obvious that the region was suffering from a deadly drought. Things were about to get even worse. In the middle of the crisis, a young boy approached with sparkling eyes, asking if the girl was the magical savior the village chief had gone to find. He passionately defended the chief against rumors that he had abandoned everyone, insisting the man had always fought for the health and harvest of the entire village. Excited beyond belief, the kid pointed at the protagonist and declared that his biggest dream was to grow up and become a witch's loyal servant. The mage laughed before correcting the misunderstanding, explaining that her companion wasn't a servant at all, but a summoned beast. Curious, the little boy asked if that title made him even stronger, and she proudly answered yes, rubbing the young man's head as if she were petting a stray dog. The hero immediately lost it, demanding some respect and making it crystal clear that he was a human being. The light-hearted moment didn't last long. Another child came running over, desperately begging them to save his family. The witch tried to draw on more of her magic, but she had already reached her limit. Her energy was completely drained, and her body finally gave out. Realizing she was about to collapse from exhaustion, the young man caught her before she could fall. She still insisted on sacrificing herself for the village, but he cut her off, firmly telling her to get some rest. Without wasting another second, he forced open the door of an empty cottage and laid her down on a bed to recover. To reassure his partner, he promised that nobody needed magic anymore. The protagonist had already come up with a practical solution, a reliable strategy that would allow the villagers to fight the drought with their own hands. When the sun rose the next morning, the entire village was left speechless. Barrel after barrel was overflowing with fresh water, and the biggest surprise was discovering that the solution had nothing to do with magic. The shock spread through the crowd when they realized the water hadn't come from sorcery, but from the work of an ordinary man. The hero stepped forward and told them the truth. This was the power of science, a force capable of changing the impossible into reality. Looking at their confused faces, he pointed to the improvised device and explained how it worked. It was a fog collector, designed to capture moisture from the air and condense it into pure water. One machine alone wouldn't be enough for everyone, but building many of them would wipe out the drought for good. Everything finally clicked. The villagers realized the answer had been in their own hands all along, giving them a way to secure fresh water every single night. The children were especially amazed, thrilled by the discovery of a new kind of magic that any human could use whenever they wanted. The gloomy atmosphere transformed into a celebration, with the entire village cheering for the witch, the young man, and science as the heroes who had saved them all. Riding the wave of victory, the mage stood on her tiptoes and playfully ruffled her partner's hair, giving him a gentle pat on the head as a reward for fulfilling their contract. While one of the village kids watched with obvious jealousy, wishing for the same treatment, the protagonist could only feel his headache getting worse, completely annoyed at being treated like the team's pet. The celebration, however, was crushed in an instant. A squad of armed warriors stormed into the village, searching for the infamous Witch of Calamity. Panic spread immediately. Seeds of doubt quickly took root, as the villagers began wondering whether the deadly drought had actually been caused by the very girl who had just saved them. As the tension spiraled out of control, the blonde rival, Sia, quietly blended into the crowd, keeping her eyes fixed on the water-collecting machine while carefully studying every detail of the invention. The blonde was fascinated by the machine the group had left behind. The brilliance of the device only fueled her obsession with capturing her rival's companion at any cost. With the village's crisis resolved, she immediately resumed her hunt for the pair. Far away, the borders of Caroline, the mage's homeland, were drowning in despair. The devastating drought had spread there as well, creating the perfect opportunity for scoundrels to profit. A ruthless merchant was charging outrageous prices for nothing more than a few sips of water. When a poor man begged for help because he couldn't afford it, he was thrown out without an ounce of mercy. Watching the scene unfold, the protagonist felt a deep sense of disgust, realizing that limitless greed existed in every world. Unable to tolerate such cowardice, the witch stepped forward. Gathering what little magic she had left, she summoned fresh water and freely placed it into the desperate man's hands. Her act of kindness immediately attracted the thirsty crowd, wiping out the merchant's entire customer base. Furious as he watched his monopoly collapse, the profiteer lashed out. Waving an official contract in their faces, he demanded that they stop giving away water, claiming he held the exclusive rights to the region's entire water supply. The girl stood her ground, arguing that she wasn't selling anything and therefore wasn't breaking any market laws. The villain immediately twisted the situation, insisting that destroying his profits was the real crime. The mage threatened to take the matter directly to the city's ruler, but the merchant simply laughed. Shielded by his hired thugs, he issued a deadly ultimatum. If the group continued interfering with his business, they would all disappear right there. Confident that the authorities would never care enough to investigate, the tension reached its breaking point, violence just moments away, when something suddenly cut through the air. A cavalry unit charged through the crowd, forcing everyone aside. The merchant instantly changed his attitude, pretending to be the victim and accusing the mage of ruining his business through unfair competition. But the act didn't last long. A silver-haired woman with an intimidating presence, riding alongside the troops, listened to his lies before silencing him with a brutal slap across the face. As the liar whimpered on the ground, the newly arrived woman walked toward the protagonist and respectfully dropped to one knee, addressing the feudal lord with absolute reverence. The young man froze, convinced he had somehow become a noble overnight, until he realized the gesture wasn't meant for him at all. It was directed entirely at Rina, who was standing right behind him. The story cut straight to the inside of a massive fortress. The protagonist's brief moment of peace was shattered when a maid suddenly barged into the bathroom, completely ignoring his privacy. The intruder pulled out a measuring tape and informed him that she needed his physical measurements for the castle's official resident registry. Feeling cornered by the awkward situation, he grabbed a bucket to cover himself, backed deeper into the bathwater, and demanded that she keep her distance. Trying to escape the invasive inspection, he offered to fill out the registration paperwork himself. The maid accepted the proposal, but issued a serious warning. She insisted every detail had to be accurate, explaining that falsifying official information was strictly forbidden, and ordered him to personally deliver the completed document to the council chamber, where he would find Rina. As soon as the door closed behind her, the hero let out a long sigh, finally getting a moment of peace to finish his bath. The young man stepped out of the tub, still trying to process everything. It was hard to believe that someone like Rina held such an influential position. As he got dressed, he reflected on the irony that nobility, no matter the world, always seemed disconnected from the suffering of ordinary people. Even so, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was different from the other aristocrats he had encountered. Before reaching Rina's room, he stopped after hearing a heated argument. The silver-haired woman, Ruby, was demanding an explanation for the young mage's return to the territory. There had been a long-standing agreement forbidding Rina from returning before turning 18, or before learning to control her destructive powers. At last, he understood the source of Rina's constant guilt. She lived in fear of accidentally hurting someone. Ruby was unwavering. She declared that Rina had to leave immediately for the royal capital to fulfill her duties. The protagonist froze. Sending her there after everything she'd endured as a prisoner would be no different from sending her to the slaughter. Unable to stay silent, he burst into the room and spoke his mind. He questioned how anyone could demand her return so coldly, and reminded them that she was still facing the very real threat of being burned at the stake. Silence filled the room, heavy with tension. Rina tried to calm the situation, explaining that she would tell the truth once she reached the capital. But first, she needed to finish helping with the drought and pay her respects at her mother's grave. Ruby, however, refused to budge. She argued that protecting the territory had been a direct order from Rina's late mother, and that allowing the young mage to keep using her magic would drastically reduce her combat strength, something the kingdom simply couldn't afford. The discussion reached a deadlock as Ruby insisted the castle's defense came first, and even claimed that, technically, water witches weren't meant to exist just to save commoners. The atmosphere in the hall exploded. The protagonist could no longer tolerate the noble's indifference and bluntly pointed out the hypocrisy of keeping plenty of water for luxury inside the castle, while people outside were dying of thirst. Without the slightest hint of remorse, Ruby coldly replied that the lower class should deal with its own misfortune, as though the lives of the poor were disposable. Horrified by such cruelty, Rina reaffirmed her determination to use every last drop of her power to save those who were suffering. Ruby finally lost her patience. Slamming her hand onto the table, she accused the mage of being childish and reckless, arguing that someone as valuable as Rina couldn't be wasted on ordinary people. The two women locked eyes, standing like immovable walls as their ideals clashed head-on. Caught in the middle, the young man finally stepped in. Acknowledging the difficulty of protecting an entire territory and the dangers of leaving it vulnerable, he proposed a strategic alternative, combining the powers of wind and ice witches with scientific knowledge to solve the crisis together. Rina stared at her partner in amazement, while Ruby merely clenched her fists, unable to believe the young mage trusted a man's fantasies so completely. Before the debate could continue, hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway. A young woman with reddish-brown hair entered the room, bringing along the crooked merchant from earlier, determined to confront Ruby about the lady's return. The newcomer introduced herself as Merida, vice president of the Fano Chamber of Commerce. With a carefully measured bow, she formally apologized to the ruler of the territory. Following her lead, the merchant presented an official document confirming his legal rights to sell water, attempting to absolve himself of any wrongdoing. He claimed he had never known the young woman was a noble and, in an obvious performance, swore that he would remove every water witch from the region and shut down all water-related trade as an act of repentance. Hearing that promise, Ruby immediately lowered her guard, concern spreading across her face. If the witches left, the entire territory would collapse. The protagonist, however, wasn't fooled for a second. He saw straight through the political maneuver hidden behind the polite diplomacy. Those two sly foxes simply wanted to seize the magical workforce, dominate the market, and squeeze out outrageous profits. To everyone's surprise, Rina stepped in without hesitation. Speaking with remarkable generosity, she cleared the merchant of any wrongdoing, explaining that he hadn't known who he was speaking to, and pleaded for the water witches to be allowed to continue serving the kingdom. Her merciful attitude left the swindler cornered. He exchanged desperate glances with Merida, who quickly realized their trap had failed. Keeping her composed smile, she ordered him to put away his license while praising the feudal lady's kindness. Ruby let out a sigh of relief, although the tension in the room remained almost unbearable. Maintaining her cynical smile, Merida delivered one last jab, suggesting the merchant still deserved some punishment since the original plan had always been to remove the witches from the territory. Ruby immediately cut her off, declaring that the lady's decision was final and that not a single witch would be leaving. The silent clash between the two women was impossible to ignore. Merida then shifted the conversation to the drought relief plan, openly mocking the idea of combining the powers of wind and ice witches. With obvious contempt, she declared that the strategy was doomed to fail. Since ice witches were incredibly rare throughout the kingdom, anyone with that specialization was considered exceptionally valuable. Taking advantage of that fact, Merida offered them access to a classroom on the 4th floor as a supposed gesture of goodwill to support their efforts. While Rina happily welcomed the offer, Shiryu remained suspicious, convinced there had to be a hidden catch behind such sudden generosity. Merida quickly revealed her true conditions. In exchange for the services of an elite ice witch, her guild would receive complete control over the territory's pricing throughout the drought. Even Ruby immediately recognized how outrageous the demand was, rejecting the proposal on the spot and calling it complete nonsense. But against everyone's expectations, Rina ignored Ruby's warning and accepted Merida's deal. The red-haired woman could barely hide her victorious smile. She promised to arrange all the preparations and provide them with a workshop, while secretly planning how to squeeze even more favors out of them once they became truly desperate. Before leaving, she issued one final warning. Danger was already approaching the capital, and a major threat was rapidly closing in on the kingdom's borders. Time was running out. As Merida walked away, anxiety filled the room, while Shiryu's curiosity about Rina's past and the history of the kingdom only grew stronger. Remaining cautious, he stopped her before she could leave and insisted on getting answers about the hierarchy of witches and the limits of their magical abilities. Rina explained the basics. There were 9 levels of magical power, each one attainable only through grueling trials. As for magical specialization, witches were normally limited to a single elemental affinity. However, she admitted that her own case was a remarkable exception. When they finally arrived at the abandoned alchemy workshop, they found it buried beneath thick layers of dust, a forgotten place that had once been a center of research, as Rina prepared to reveal the true nature of her powers. Unlike every other witch, Rina could control 5 different elements, lacking only ice. She had reached level 9, the highest rank possible, making her an exceptionally rare phenomenon. Shiryu's question about why she constantly collapsed was quickly answered. Her body simply couldn't withstand the enormous amount of energy required to use magic on that scale. Their goal there was entirely practical. Shiryu laid out a technical blueprint for building a nitrogen generator. To make it work, he needed Rina to use her fire magic to power the workshop's forge. Under his careful supervision, she precisely controlled the flames. The process required delicate adjustments and frequent breaks to prevent her from collapsing, but Rina's magic dramatically reduced the time needed to finish the construction. The device was finally complete. Impressed by the result, Shiryu praised her work and, without thinking much of it, gently patted Rina on the head. The unexpected gesture caught the young witch completely off guard, stirring feelings she didn't yet know how to understand. He went on to explain that the machine would be the key to producing nitrogen and, ultimately, creating the artificial rain they would need once the other specialist witches arrived. The prediction came true almost immediately when Merida's witches arrived. Floor, the wind witch, looked exhausted and completely uninterested, while Hinless, the ice witch, carried herself like a scholar, complete with glasses and stacks of books. The atmosphere grew tense when Rina introduced Shiryu as the person leading the project. The newcomers reacted with disbelief and open contempt, unable to accept taking orders from a man in a society where men were seen as little more than subordinates. Shiryu ignored their prejudice and got straight to the point. The project depended on their abilities, and social status needed to take a back seat to the urgent need for their magic. The newcomers' skepticism was obvious. Floor and Hinless looked at Shiryu's machine with nothing but disdain, refusing to believe that a pile of metal with no trace of magical power could possibly solve the drought. To them, the entire plan was a bad joke. Their intention was simply to show up, collect their payment, and leave as soon as possible. Unbothered by their judgment, Shiryu ignored the criticism and adjusted a pressure gauge on the machine. When he explained that it was used to monitor the internal pressure, Floor scoffed, insisting the device was pointless since they could simply judge everything by sight. Paying no attention to her complaints, Shiryu instructed her to use her wind magic to increase the tank's pressure until the needle reached 15. Annoyed at being ordered around by a man, Floor unleashed a powerful whirlwind into the machine. Noticing her constant yawning, Shiryu played it smart. He promised that if she reached the 15 mark, she'd be free to rest immediately afterward. The promise of a break gave her the motivation she needed. She poured even more magic into the task, but the effort quickly became overwhelming. Exhaustion hit Floor almost immediately. Unable to keep going, she collapsed into a chair completely drained, while the pressure gauge hadn't even reached 5. The failure sparked a heated argument. Deeply offended, Floor snapped that she was a high-ranking witch and the only one who had passed the kingdom's rigorous promotion exam, accusing Shiryu of designing a useless machine just to humiliate her. The room sank into disappointment as the frustrated witch fumed over her wasted effort. Then, without warning, the silence was broken by a mechanical click. The pressure gauge suddenly began moving on its own, accelerating until it shot far beyond the target, leaving everyone in stunned disbelief as the machine unexpectedly sprang to life. The needle hadn't surged because of Floor's magic. It was Reina who had secretly poured her own wind magic into the machine, pushing it past the required level. Shiryu couldn't hide his admiration, while Floor, lying helplessly on the floor, suffered a complete existential crisis after watching a stranger accomplish in seconds what had taken her an entire lifetime to master. With the nitrogen now being extracted, Shiryu connected a hose to guide the invisible, odorless gas into a specially prepared container. Only one final step remained. Hinless had to cool it to the point where it became liquid nitrogen. Still bitter over what had happened, Floor tried to stop her partner, insisting Shiryu was only making a mockery of their magic for his own amusement. But Hinless, eager to prove herself during her very first official assignment, ignored the warning. Gathering every ounce of her ice magic into a concentrated sphere, she attempted to force the gas to change into its liquid state. The attempt failed completely. Only moments later, Hinless collapsed, trembling with exhaustion, as she admitted the task was far more difficult than any trial she had ever faced. Shiryu's disappointment was immediate. Without liquid nitrogen, the entire artificial rain project would come to an end before it had even begun. The situation quickly turned into a frustrating cycle. Hinless would try, fail, collapse, recover, and try again, spiraling deeper into physical and mental exhaustion with every attempt. Watching her friend push herself beyond her limits and visibly break under the weight of repeated failure, Floor finally snapped at Shiryu, blaming him for everything that had happened to Hinless. Declaring the job over, the Wind Witch helped her friend to her feet and walked out of the workshop, abandoning the project before any real progress could be made. The day's work had finally come to an end. As the two witches walked away carrying the weight of frustration and wounded pride, Reina surprised Shiryu by drenching him with a blast of cold water, believing it would help relieve his mental fatigue. He saw things very differently. From his perspective, the witches had barely put in the minimum effort, while all he had done was explain the theory, and somehow that alone had been enough to upset them. In an almost patronizing tone, Reina suggested their hostility was simply the natural result of technical ignorance, then patted him on the head again, treating him like her favorite pet. Their routine was interrupted by an unexpected discovery. After noticing that Hinless had accidentally left her book behind in the workshop, Shiryu immediately began reading it. The information inside proved invaluable. Within minutes, he uncovered the fundamental principle behind the decomposition and reconstruction of matter, the very foundation of magic that had eluded him until now. Meanwhile, absent-mindedly finishing the rest of Rena's glass of water, he unknowingly made the girl blush as she interpreted it as an indirect kiss. Completely oblivious to her embarrassment, his mind was already putting together the final solution to their plan. The following day, the workshop was ready. Shiryu now had 4 fully operational machines waiting, and all that remained was for the specialist witches to return. When they finally arrived, their lack of enthusiasm was impossible to miss. Skipping all formalities, Shiryu looked directly at Hinless and calmly announced that he had finally figured out how she could liquefy the nitrogen. The response was nothing but contempt. To Floor, the idea that a man who couldn't use magic would dare teach a witch anything was downright insulting. She insisted that not even someone as gifted as Rina could manipulate ice magic the way he described and advised him to keep quiet before he embarrassed himself with such ridiculous claims. Shiryu remained completely unfazed by the ridicule. Calmly, he challenged both witches, declaring that his understanding of ice went far beyond anything they could sense through magic alone. Floor stubbornly argued that an ordinary man could never possess a witch's talent, while Hinless confirmed she couldn't detect even the slightest trace of ice magic coming from him. Instead of arguing, Shiryu simply acted. He took a small amount of saltpeter, a substance commonly found in old buildings and easy to purify, and poured it into a container of water before covering it. The effect was immediate. To Hinless's astonishment, she felt the temperature plummet almost instantly. Shiryu explained the scientific principle. As saltpeter dissolves, it absorbs heat from the surrounding water. When he removed the lid, a wave of icy air escaped, revealing the truth. In his hand rested a perfectly formed cube of ice, proving that the secret behind ice magic wasn't creating ice from nothing, it was precisely controlling heat. Hinless gently touched the ice, feeling its genuine chill against her fingertips. Her disbelief quickly gave way to genuine understanding. Letting go of her arrogance, she respectfully approached Shiryu and asked him to teach her. He got straight to the point. Her magic wasn't about creating ice out of thin air, it was about manipulating the heat stored within the moisture in the air. He instructed her to focus on the nitrogen inside the machine, treating it not as empty space, but as a substance whose heat needed to be extracted. Guided by Shiryu's new perspective, Hinless channeled her magic once again. The temperature dropped steadily and with remarkable efficiency. Within moments, the nitrogen transformed into liquid right before everyone's eyes. Hinless was overwhelmed with excitement. For the first time, she had succeeded without exhausting herself to the point of collapse. Floor, who had mocked the entire idea only moments earlier, watched her world turn upside down. Overcome by equal parts embarrassment over her own arrogance and renewed hope, the Wind Witch stepped toward Shiryu, swallowing her pride at last to ask for his guidance. Hinless was ecstatic. She had finally succeeded without exhausting herself to the point of collapse. Floor, who had been mocking the entire experiment just moments earlier, watched her world turn upside down. Torn between embarrassment over her own arrogance and a newfound spark of hope, the atmosphere inside the castle collapsed when an exhausted guard rushed in with alarming news. A massive crowd of refugees was about to storm the fortress. Their goal was simple and desperate: to steal water. The angry shouts of the mob, armed with torches and farm tools, echoed through the walls, turning the night into a nightmare. Blinded by rage, the crowd pointed directly at Rina, branding her the cause of the drought and demanding her immediate expulsion under the cruel title of the Witch of Calamity. Shaken, Rina stood at the window staring down at the crowd, feeling unworthy of the legacy she had inherited. The city's hatred was nothing new. It had followed her since childhood, ever since her magic first awakened and unleashed a disaster that even her own mother couldn't stop. To Shiryu, however, that resentment made no sense. From a logical standpoint, human beings simply couldn't control the weather. In his eyes, Rina wasn't the source of disasters. She was the key to solving them. Concepts like inherited guilt meant nothing to him. If something couldn't be supported by logic, it wasn't worth believing. Outside, the situation reached its breaking point. Convinced that the nobles were hoarding water while everyone else was dying of thirst, the crowd decided to force its way inside. Standing at the front lines, Ruby declared that any attempt to breach the castle would be met with force. But desperation had become stronger than the fear of death. The pressure against the walls became unbearable. With a deafening crash, the main gates gave way, allowing a wave of furious villagers to flood into the courtyard. Soldiers immediately took their positions, and a direct clash between the guards and the desperate mob became inevitable. The tragedy was stopped at the very last second. Rina and Shiryu stepped in front of the crowd, ordering the soldiers not to fight back. The response was immediate. A furious woman accused Rina of being a fraud while a man hurled a stone straight at her. The rock struck the witch head-on, and Shiryu rushed to protect her as the enraged villagers reopened old wounds surrounding Rina's mother's death, pelting the pair with a relentless barrage of stones. Without hesitation, Shiryu threw himself in front of Rina, using his own body as a shield. Furious but protected behind him, Rina let out a cry that silenced the entire courtyard. Shiryu then addressed the crowd, demanding an end to the violence and announcing that the artificial rain would be ready the following day. He made one thing perfectly clear: if his promise failed, he would personally accept the consequences. When the crowd dismissed his words because he was nothing more than a man without magic, Rina stepped in, creating a powerful wall of wind that suspended every stone in midair. As tense silence fell over the crowd, the group withdrew to the alchemy workshop, followed closely by the villagers carrying blazing torches. Floor and Hinless were already waiting inside, but the skepticism hadn't disappeared. Launching liquid nitrogen high enough into the sky would require an enormous amount of magical power, something Floor insisted only Rina was capable of providing. Just as Rina prepared to unleash the magic they needed, the plan was suddenly interrupted. A lone figure appeared on the rooftop, watching them from above like an omen. It was Sia. The atmosphere inside the workshop instantly changed as Rina looked up at the newcomer and asked whether this was her final move to arrest her. With an icy smile, Sia confirmed it. Rina's arrest was inevitable. Remembering Shiryu's words that no one was born guilty and that the title of Witch of Calamity was nothing but a lie. Rina firmly rejected the ultimatum, declaring her innocence without hesitation. Irritated by her answer, Sia threatened to burn everything to the ground if they continued resisting, making it clear that Shiryu's machines would be her first targets. Shiryu immediately recognized the danger. Liquid nitrogen would become highly unstable under intense heat. While Hinless desperately struggled to keep the machines cold enough to function, Floor attempted to intercept Sia, only to be driven back by a blazing wall of fire. As a level 8 witch, Sia's overwhelming power completely outmatched Floor's. Rina, however, hesitated. Fighting Sia would drain the very magic she needed to perform the teleportation required for the artificial rain. Sia continued her psychological assault, promising that she would leave behind no trace of anyone or anything. Chaos spread through the workshop. Hinless finally reached her physical limit. The temperature continued climbing, and the impatient villagers, desperate for dawn to arrive, began pressuring the group, convinced the entire plan had been nothing but an elaborate lie. Without a shred of mercy, Sia unleashed flames toward the refugees, forcing Rina into an impossible choice. Her ultimatum was brutally simple: surrender herself as a prisoner, or abandon the very people who hated her and let them burn alive. Rina slowly closed her eyes, remembering her mother's final lesson. The people's hatred had never been the result of a curse, it had always been born from fear, and her true purpose was never to be a walking disaster, but a ruler who protected her people. Determined to change the fate of those people, Rina began surrendering herself to protect everyone, reaching out her hand towards Sia. Shiryu, however, shouted for her to stop. He warned that if she gave in now, she would condemn those people to eternal ignorance, preventing the truth behind the drought from ever coming to light. Shiryu faced Sia's flames and challenged the very logic of magic itself. Amused by his boldness, Sia allowed him to try, curious to see just how far Rina's pet could actually go. Shiryu quickly barked out instructions to his allies. Hinless needed to focus on absorbing the heat surrounding the flames, while Floor had to use her wind magic not to create airflow, but to pull every bit of air away from the fire. It was an incredibly risky strategy, a forced vacuum designed to suffocate the flames. Despite her exhaustion, Hinless accepted without hesitation. Floor, true to her sarcastic nature, joked that if the plan failed and she died, she'd come back to haunt him as a ghost. The moment Sia attempted to teleport Rina away, the plan went into action. The combination of removing the air and draining the heat triggered an immediate elemental reaction. Deprived of both oxygen and thermal energy, Sia's flames instantly died out, dissolving the fiery barrier that had terrified everyone. Sia was left completely stunned. The power she had always believed to be absolute had just been neutralized by witches far beneath her rank. Floor and Hinless could hardly believe what they had accomplished themselves, but the opening they needed was finally there. Rina seized the opportunity, slipping free from Sia's grasp while staying focused on her true mission. The moment had finally arrived, and Shiryu's strategy was about to prove Rina's innocence once and for all. Rina launched the alchemical devices high into the clouds. The countdown ended with a powerful explosion, scattering liquid nitrogen throughout the atmosphere. The reaction was immediate. The dry, dusty sky gave way to a heavy, life-saving rainfall that poured over the land. Frozen in place, Sia watched everything she believed in crumble before her eyes. Overwhelmed with relief, Rina threw her arms around Shiryu and thanked him for everything, affectionately calling him her summoned beast. He accepted the praise, even though he secretly hoped the day would come when she found a less humiliating title for him. Blushing, Rina simply looked away, quietly leaving that promise for another day. The crowd, once consumed by hatred, now gazed at the falling rain with reverence. Their resentment faded, replaced by understanding. Rina wasn't a bringer of disaster, she was a symbol of hope. The following morning, tension returned as another crowd gathered outside the castle gates. Shiryu and Rina braced themselves for the worst, only to discover a completely different scene. The villagers hadn't come to attack, they had come to give thanks. The gratitude was sincere, something Rina had never experienced in her entire life. One of the boys who had thrown stones at her the day before timidly approached carrying a bouquet of flowers, tearfully asking for forgiveness. True to her gentle nature, Rina softly patted the boy's head and told him there was nothing to apologize for, finally bringing peace between the ruler and her people. Although the atmosphere had become peaceful, new developments quickly followed. As Rina happily admired the flowers blooming thanks to the very rain she had helped create, Floor and Hinless made their way through the crowd. They carried a formal invitation from Merida, who requested an urgent meeting. Ruby immediately criticized the vice president's lack of etiquette, arguing that someone of Merida's position should be the one visiting the ruler, not the other way around. Shiryu, as practical as ever, ignored all the formalities. He knew the invitation came with hidden motives, especially now that the drought had been resolved under the terms of their previous agreement. Determined to confront whatever game Merida was playing, he and Rina headed straight for the Chamber of Commerce. Merida welcomed them with exaggerated politeness, putting on a display of false humility that fooled absolutely no one. Before she could begin weaving her web around Reina, Shiryu stepped forward. He caught her completely off guard by openly stating that the group was willing to support the expansion of the artificial rain technology, anticipating exactly what she intended to ask, while immediately demanding proper compensation for their work. The conversation, however, soon took a darker turn. Dropping her courteous facade, Merida brought up a critical issue. Rina was still facing criminal charges, and the witch guard was already hunting her down. Wearing a calculated smile, she pointed out that if anything happened to the young ruler, Shiryu would inevitably suffer the consequences as well. To prove she wasn't making empty threats, she produced a document describing the Pact-Breaker dagger. Its purpose was simple but astonishing. It could sever the summoning contract binding Shiryu and Rina together. The revelation left Shiryu speechless, as he realized he might finally have a way to regain his complete freedom. Merida confirmed the dagger's existence, displaying an illustration of the artifact while explaining exactly how it worked. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. In theory, breaking the summoning contract could return Shiryu to the exact instant of his original death, a possibility that deeply unsettled him. Merida quickly reassured him that the dagger would only sever the magical bond and carried no fatal side effects, insisting she had no intention of losing someone as talented as he was. The weight of that revelation struck Rina harder than anyone else. Although she understood that freeing Shiryu would guarantee his survival if anything ever happened to her, the thought of losing him tore her apart inside. She was prepared to make the sacrifice and break the bond herself, but Shiryu saw the hesitation in her eyes. Before she could say another word, he gently took her hand and asked Merida if they could speak in private. While the two of them stepped away for a private conversation, Merida went to meet with Sia. Their discussion revealed a hint of irritation. Shiryu's ability to create rain was as unprecedented as it was troublesome. Sia then turned her attention to the still vulnerable Rina. With a rough motion, she lifted the young witch's chin and revealed an even greater threat, the imminent arrival of the Witch of Judgment, Evely. The name alone was enough to fill Rina with paralyzing fear. Painful memories from her youth flooded back, reminding her how mercilessly that instructor had treated any witch branded a heretic. Sia, savoring every second of it, described the ruthless punishment awaiting her. But to Sia's surprise, Rina didn't shrink back in despair. She brushed Sia's hand away and confidently repeated what Shiryu had taught her. She wasn't the Witch of Calamity, and her teacher's verdict would never define who she truly was. Before Sia could mock her again, Rina cut her off, ready to face the future that had once terrified her. The moment she escaped Sia's presence, Rina ran straight to Shiryu's side. Even so, Sia had left behind a seed of doubt, poisoning Rina's thoughts with fears about her past and how Shiryu might react if he ever learned the truth. During the entire walk back, she remained completely silent, her mind consumed by the looming arrival of her former mentor, the dreaded Witch of Judgment. Sensing the weight on her heart, Shiryu tried to lighten the mood, but Rina quietly led him somewhere instead. When they arrived, she was carrying a bouquet of flowers. They had come to her mother's grave, the resting place of the guardian who had devoted her life to protecting those people. Standing there, Rina admitted that returning to her homeland had always been driven by this one silent wish. She thanked Shiryu for being the miracle that had preserved her mother's legacy and for giving her the chance to pay her final respects. She spoke with such sincerity and sadness that Shiryu, feeling awkward under the weight of so much emotion, gently pinched her cheek to snap her back to reality. Then he spoke plainly. Without her summoning him, he would have already been dead, and now his life was tied to hers. He suggested breaking the master-servant contract not as a farewell, but as a promise. Even without the magical bond, he would remain by her side of his own free will and make sure no harm ever came to her. Moved to tears, Rina threw her arms around him. Beneath the moonlight, the emotional walls she had built around herself finally crumbled, replaced by complete trust. As Shiryu gently comforted her, the fear of the coming judgment gradually faded, replaced by the certainty that as long as they stood together, destiny itself no longer had to be feared. Later that night, Shiryu walked through the quiet streets carrying a deeply asleep Rina on his back. The unusual sight didn't go unnoticed. One child even joked that the witch was riding her summoned beast. Embarrassed at being used as a human pillow, Shiryu could only sigh and keep walking. Their trip was interrupted when they unexpectedly ran into Floor and Hinless. Feeling awkward about carrying Rina, Shiryu asked what they were doing out so late. Hinless answered directly. They had officially ended all ties with the Chamber of Commerce. Worried about the future of the artificial rain project, Shiryu immediately tried to convince them otherwise, concerned that there simply weren't enough qualified witches capable of handling the nitrogen process. Their answer caught him completely off guard. They hadn't resigned over money. In fact, they were already wealthy enough to live comfortably. The real reason was that they wanted to work directly under him. Pulling out a heavy bag filled with gold coins, Hinless laid out their terms. They would cover all of their own expenses, request a monthly salary with raises every 6 months, and in return, Shiryu had to continue helping them improve their magical abilities. Shiryu was left speechless by the unusual proposal. As their future employer, he was somehow the one being paid for access to his knowledge. Not wanting to take advantage of the two witches, he initially refused the fortune they offered, but they insisted on becoming his partners. Eventually, he accepted the agreement, quietly smiling to himself as he realized he had just secured 2 elite allies. To top it all off, he revealed that they would no longer have to rely on the exhausting teleportation spell, because he had already come up with an entirely new plan for what came next. Floor and Hinless were so eager to learn Shiryu's next idea that they were willing to do whatever it took. Their peaceful moment, however, didn't last long. The following morning, the threat finally arrived. Evely, the stern witch of judgment, and Tylan, a legendary battle witch celebrated as a goddess of war, entered the city under the admiring gaze of the townspeople. Sia personally welcomed them and attempted to explain her earlier failure. She told Evely, a woman with an intimidating presence and an uncompromising demeanor, that capturing Rina had become politically impossible. After the miraculous rainfall, the people now viewed the young witch as their savior, and using force against her would destroy the royal family's reputation. Sia also reminded Evely that, 8 years earlier, the council had already concluded that Rina couldn't be controlled against her own will. Dismissing any concern about public opinion, Evely coldly declared that the punishment of the heretic was necessary to preserve order and introduced Tylan as the weapon that would carry out her judgment, while tensions continued rising outside. With more witches observing the success of Shiryu's artificial rain technique, events inside the castle were unfolding differently. A servant arrived with a summons from Ruby for Rina. Shiryu, who had spent his time studying the kingdom's laws, immediately realized the decisive moment had finally arrived. He was ready. As they entered the grand hall, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. Before a large gathering of nobles and officials, Ruby respectfully asked Rina to take her place upon the throne. Hesitating, the young witch searched for reassurance in Shiryu's eyes. He simply nodded, encouraging her to move forward. The moment she sat down, the mood of the room completely changed. Ruby knelt before her, formally acknowledging her as the rightful feudal lady of Caroline. One by one, everyone else followed, bowing in recognition of her authority. The ceremony reached its climax when Ruby presented Rina with the official crest of her office, marking the definitive recognition of her status throughout the kingdom. The emblem, a personal keepsake that had once belonged to Rina's mother, was finally placed into the hands of its rightful heir. Ruby's decision to safeguard the crest all those years caught Rina completely off guard. The ceremony carried far more than symbolic meaning. By accepting her role as the ruler of Caroline under the direct protection of the Estella royal family, Rina would gain political immunity, rendering any pursuit by the Witch Oversight Council legally invalid. Strengthened by Shiryu's promises and confident that she had already passed her scientific knowledge on to the other witches, Rina took the final step. Before the entire court, she accepted her position as the 13th ruler of Caroline. Her oath to protect the territory was sealed with the loyalty of the gathered nobles. But the triumphant moment was suddenly interrupted when a violent storm erupted over the castle without warning. While the people celebrated what they believed to be a second divine blessing, Shiryu immediately recognized that something had gone terribly wrong. The rainfall didn't match the scientific pattern of the previous one. Excessive use of liquid nitrogen had created a dangerous mushroom-shaped cloud. Panicked, Floor and Hinless admitted that the ritual had failed. Their magical execution had completely spiraled out of control, causing the weather to become dangerously unstable. As if that weren't enough, Evely arrived with her entourage right in the middle of the chaos. The Witch of Judgment wasted no time investigating. The instant she saw the unnatural storm, her eyes lit up with opportunity. She publicly pointed at Rina, accusing her of once again bringing disaster upon the land. The trial had officially begun. Evely spared no venom as she laid out her charges. She accused Rina of escaping custody, resisting execution, violating the terms of her exile, and ultimately causing the devastating storm now raging across the territory. Demanding an immediate confession, Evely fixed her gaze on Rina, who stood frozen under the crushing pressure. Hoping to restore reason, Hinless stepped forward and accepted responsibility for the magical malfunction herself, but Evely dismissed every explanation that didn't support her predetermined verdict. The chaos intensified when a soldier rushed in to report that the castle's main gate had been destroyed by the violent winds and that a massive crowd was flooding into the courtyard. Evely immediately declared it proof that the people feared Rina. Reality, however, told a completely different story. The villagers hadn't come to attack, they had come to protect their ruler. Even the merchant stepped forward to speak on behalf of the crowd, declaring that the rain was a blessing, not a curse, and that they would never allow anyone to take Rina away. Ignoring the people's voices, the Witch of Judgment dragged Rina back into the darkest chapter of her past. She recalled the awakening of Rina's magic at the age of 9, claiming that she had summoned magical beasts and caused her own mother's death. She went even further, accusing Rina of wiping out an entire village after fleeing her punishment. Evely then delivered her verdict. Rina's silence was an admission of guilt, and the sentence would be carried out without further delay. The guards stepped forward to arrest her, but Shiryu blocked their path. Standing firmly between Evely and Rina, he loudly declared that every accusation Evely had made was nothing more than a cynical fabrication, and that he would never allow such an injustice to be carried out while he was there. Shiryu promised to protect Rina no matter what, but a woman interrupted him, insisting that Rina was guilty beyond forgiveness. Ignoring the pressure around him, he stood tall, revealing the message printed on his clothing, a declaration of science's superiority over blind dogma. With bold confidence, he openly challenged the authority of the tribunal, leaving Evely visibly irritated. Remaining perfectly composed, Shiryu turned to the crowd and asked a simple question. Had anyone actually witnessed the magical beast invasion 9 years earlier? When the villagers admitted that they had only known the beasts appeared sometime after Rina's magical awakening, Shiryu argued that the timing alone proved nothing. At most, it was merely a coincidence between her awakening and the monster's arrival. Evely tried twisting the logic, insisting that the events happening at the same time proved they were connected. Shiryu countered with a simple analogy. If criminals break into a restaurant because they're attracted by the smell of delicious food, no one blames the chef, they blame the criminals. The monsters were responsible for the destruction, not the person they happened to target. The situation shifted when Evely claimed that the royal family had established a supervision pact with Lord Caroline, one that Rina had violated by fleeing. She confidently described witnessing the moment Rina supposedly lost control of her powers and destroyed an entire village, presenting herself as an eyewitness to the disaster. Once her accusation ended, Shiryu turned toward Rina and asked her to tell everyone exactly what had happened. He wanted Rina to recount the events without outside influence, so he could compare her testimony against the actual evidence. Rina admitted that her memories of the tragedy were hazy. When she regained consciousness, all she could see was destruction surrounding her. With her mentor's permission, she faced the gathered crowd and, invoking her status as the third princess, solemnly swore that every word she spoke was the absolute truth. Evely responded with an outright lie. She claimed that when she arrived at the scene, she found Rina floating above the ruins, using that single image as proof of her guilt. Shiryu immediately dismantled the argument, pointing out that finding someone at the scene of a disaster doesn't mean witnessing them cause it. Simply being present is not evidence of responsibility. The crowd began questioning Evely's authority, and one merchant loudly suggested that the entire trial was nothing more than a political scheme to suppress Caroline's growing influence. Furious at the murmuring, Evely unleashed her magic. A blazing sphere of fire materialized above the crowd, silencing everyone in an instant. Declaring the matter settled, She ordered Rina's immediate arrest and warned that anyone who attempted to protect the fugitive would face severe punishment themselves. Faced with the threat, Shiryu let out a mocking laugh. He hadn't come unprepared. He had thoroughly studied the Empire's legal code, memorizing every loophole and every statute. He knew exactly where Evely had slipped up. Shiryu dismantled Evely's authority by citing a long-forgotten clause in the Imperial Code. Any defendant who resists a proven injustice is acting in legitimate self-defense. Since Rina's innocence was the very issue under dispute, her escape was no longer a crime but a justified act of resistance. Shiryu's flawless legal argument stunned everyone present. In just a few days, he had mastered a legal system made up of thousands of articles. Cornered, Evely changed tactics and targeted Rina's mind instead, forcing her to question her own convictions. As the young witch faltered and struggled to speak, the third princess stepped forward and confronted the Inquisitor herself. She declared that without concrete evidence, no one had the right to strip Rina of her sovereignty. Pressed by undeniable logic, Evely resorted to religious fanaticism. Raising her magical seal, she invoked a divine judgment in the name of the goddess of magic, claiming it was the ultimate method of exposing heretics. The terms were simple. If Rina survived the supernatural trial, she would officially be declared innocent of being a calamity. Seeing what seemed like their final chance to clear Caroline's ruler's name, the townspeople began believing this was the only path to the truth. The situation looked hopeless, and Rina was overwhelmed with fear. Ruby approached her with a solemn expression and revealed a bitter truth. Since the Witch Council had been established, not a single witch had survived the goddess's judgment. A visibly shaken Hinless confirmed it, reminding everyone that even the greatest dark witch in history had failed the trial. Without an ounce of mercy, Evely used those past failures to seal Rina's fate, branding every previous victim as a heretic who had deserved their end. She even taunted the group, claiming that refusing the trial would be nothing more than an admission of guilt. Despite their fear, the townspeople stood firmly behind Rina, convinced of her innocence. To Shiryu, this wasn't divine justice. It was nothing more than a dirty political trap, an outdated method the council used to eliminate its enemies. He knew refusing wasn't an option. When Rina accepted the challenge, Shiryu immediately stepped beside her, insisting on facing the trial together. As her summoned companion, their fates were inseparably linked. Evely watched with a cold smile, pleased that she would be able to eliminate both of them at once. The trial was scheduled for nightfall in a plaza just outside the city. With only one day left to prepare, a quiet sense of farewell filled the air. Believing it might be their final moments together, Rina asked Shiryu what his greatest wish was, determined to grant it before everything came to an end. Breaking the heavy mood with a playful grin, Shiryu didn't hesitate. He wanted a wildly successful life, millions of followers, lucrative sponsorships, a luxurious mansion, and a girlfriend. Rina dismissed Shiryu's ambitious dreams as impossible fantasies, insisting that their only priority should be surviving the trial. After a brief silence, she suddenly surprised him by throwing herself into his arms. Caught completely off guard, Shiryu's mind briefly wandered in the wrong direction, but Rina quickly explained that she was simply offering to become his girlfriend so she could fulfill his wish. When she leaned in to seal the promise with a kiss, Shiryu's overwhelming shyness brought the moment to a halt. Their awkward moment was abruptly interrupted when Chipo walked into the room without knocking. Finding the two of them in such an embarrassing position, she immediately turned bright red and hurried back out. Rina calmly scolded her for barging in without permission. Taking advantage of the interruption, Shiryu confronted Sia about her sudden change of heart. Why was someone who had once wanted Rina destroyed now trying to protect her? With a disturbingly cheerful smile, Sia admitted she wasn't acting out of kindness. She simply enjoyed watching Rina suffer. Seeing her trapped in fear and despair was far more entertaining than watching her die quickly. Shiryu immediately realized he was dealing with someone dangerously unstable, almost like an obsessive stalker. Setting her twisted motives aside, Sia explained the nature of the trial. The judgment consisted of 3 brutal stages: fire, the abyss, and the hurricane, all while the witch's magical power would be severely restricted. She also tried to find out whether the technological gadgets Shiryu carried in his backpack would still function under those conditions. Staying cautious, Shiryu prevented her from getting anywhere near his equipment and ended the conversation, thanking her only for the useful technical information. That night, Shiryu and Rina met Evely at the appointed location. Floating high above the ground, she raised a massive blue crystal into the air and declared that the divine verdict would only be delivered if both of them survived the trial. Determined to overcome the trap, Shiryu took Rina's hand, silently reassuring her before they were instantly transported into a nightmarish landscape engulfed in blazing infernal flames. They found themselves standing before a bridge that led to a central altar, surrounded by unbearable heat. Rina quickly realized the atmosphere itself had been altered. Every form of magic except fire had been suppressed to level 4 or lower. Shiryu studied the portal waiting on the other side. It reminded him of the classic dimensional portals from fantasy stories, and realized it was their only way out. The entire bridge was engulfed in flames, and a single mistake would mean instant death, leaving nothing behind. Trying to reassure him, Rina suggested using wind magic to fly over the abyss, giving the spectators outside a renewed sense of hope. Shiryu, however, remained deeply concerned. Under normal circumstances, flying would have worked, but he knew the magical restrictions, and the added weight of carrying him as her summoned companion made Rina's plan incredibly dangerous. She simply wouldn't have enough power to get them safely across. As they hovered near the edge, the blonde searched for confirmation of her suspicions about the trial. Evely answered by rapping threats in religious rhetoric, claiming that the goddess's blessing was reserved only for the faithful. Ruby immediately noticed the disturbing shift. What was supposed to be a confidential trial had become a public spectacle of cruelty, orchestrated by Evely, who made no effort to hide her desire to see Rina destroyed. The spectators watched with growing anxiety, while everyone waited to see whether Chipo had a plan. Floor and Hinless nervously followed the magical broadcast. Floor desperately prayed that Rina wouldn't rely on wind magic. At the center of the trial, Shiryu grabbed Rina's hand and begged her not to take the risk. The memory of their prison escape, when the teleportation spell had failed and sent them plummeting through the sky, was still fresh in his mind. Flustered by the unexpected contact, Rina listened as he explained how little mana existed in this realm. Before he could finish analyzing their surroundings, however, she had already cast her wind spell. A whirlwind formed around them, and Shiryu's mind immediately went into calculation mode. Level 4 wind magic would only carry them a short distance. With both of their combined weight, the flight would end in disaster. He silently thanked himself for stopping Rina's reckless idea before it got them both killed. Rina tried to argue, demonstrating her water magic and lamenting that it wasn't powerful enough to extinguish the sea of flames ahead. Shiryu cut her off, redirecting her focus. The water wasn't meant to put out the fire, it was the key to crossing it. As he sketched out his plan on the ground, Evely mocked him from afar, calling him a fool. Meanwhile, the villagers watched closely as Shiryu confidently declared that they would overcome the obstacle. Shiryu buried himself in complex calculations, refusing to leave anything to chance. Watching from the audience, Merida followed every movement with fascination. Floor recalled seeing Shiryu use similar methods before, solving impossible problems through mysterious calculations. Hinless nodded in agreement, convinced that science was the true foundation behind his unconventional strategies. Once the calculations were complete, Shiryu reached his conclusion. They would need exactly half a liter of water to make it across. He instructed Rina to surround both of them with her water magic. She hesitated, worried that the extreme heat would instantly turn the water into scalding steam and boil them alive. Shiryu calmly explained the science behind the idea, the Leidenfrost effect. At extremely high temperatures, he explained, a thin layer of vapor would instantly form between the water and the flames, acting as a perfect thermal insulator and preventing direct contact with the burning surface. Without wasting another second, Shiryu swept Rina into his arms in a bridal carry. The unexpected gesture caught her completely off guard, making her face turn bright red, while he remained entirely focused on the mission. He explained that they needed to stay as close together as possible, which left Rina so flustered she nearly forgot the life-threatening situation around them. Noticing her reaction, Shiryu couldn't help thinking that, under different circumstances, he'd probably have pinched her cheeks. At his signal, Rina focused her magic and created a sphere of water around them. Then, using wind magic as propulsion, they launched forward. The steam generated by the intense heat became the driving force behind their movement, pushing them rapidly and steadily across the blazing bridge. As the pair raced through the inferno, everyone watching from outside stared in disbelief, wondering whether such a tiny amount of water could possibly keep them alive. Evely watched with open contempt, convinced that the small amount of water would evaporate in seconds, sealing their fate. Hidden behind the thick cloud of steam, Floor and Hinless whispered desperate prayers while the villagers waited in breathless silence. Then, as two silhouettes emerged from the smoke, the truth stunned everyone. Shiryu stepped out completely unharmed, still carrying Rina in his arms. Their success left Evely speechless, though she quickly concealed her frustration to maintain her composure. Relief swept over Floor and Hinless, who excitedly praised the incredible strength of Rina's summoned companion. Even Sia and Ruby, wearing the faintest hint of a smile, had to acknowledge Shiryu's unexpected brilliance. Evely, however, immediately shut down the celebration, reminding everyone that the trial was far from over. Shiryu quickly noticed that the portal ahead was rapidly shrinking. If they did nothing, the exit would disappear within 5 minutes, sealing their fate. Rina tried to rely on her water magic once again, but he stopped her. The flames were far too intense, and any liquid barrier would evaporate in an instant. As he analyzed their surroundings, the protagonist detected something unusual. The wind element was abnormally powerful in that area. Rina confirmed it through her magical senses, realizing that fire and wind had reached a dangerously balanced state. Confidently, she suggested using that energy to levitate over the flames. Shiryu immediately rejected the idea, warning that the temperature near the ceiling was so extreme that they would be incinerated long before they could gain enough altitude. Rina canceled her levitation spell and returned to the ground, feeling guilty about her failed idea. Staying calm, Shiryu reassured her that mistakes were simply part of the process and promised to show her the correct way to use wind magic. His plan was to use the airflow to carve out a safe path through the sea of flames. The crowd watched in disbelief, whispering that wind would only make the fire burn even stronger. But Shiryu had already proven otherwise in the past when he taught Floor, a level 4 witch, how to extinguish flames using the same principle. Evely, however, wasted no opportunity to spread fear. Wearing a mocking smile, she declared that the altar was fueled by raw magical crystals and that any attempt to interfere would only speed up the pair's destruction. She encouraged everyone watching to sit back and witness their inevitable downfall. Although visibly nervous, Floor still believed in Shiryu's ability to improvise. He spoke honestly to Rina, admitting that this wasn't an exact science and that the risk was enormous. One mistake in controlling the wind would end in disaster. Even without fully understanding the scientific theory behind his plan, Rina placed complete trust in him, believing that holding his hand somehow gave her the strength she needed. His instructions were straightforward. Rina had to create 2 tornadoes, one on each side of the flames, spinning in opposite directions. As their speed increased, the air would be forced outward, creating a vacuum in the center. That low-pressure zone would pull away the oxygen the fire needed to burn, smothering the flames almost instantly. Working in perfect synchronization, the twin tornadoes sliced through the blazing wall, opening a clear path forward. The collision of the tornadoes forced the air downward, creating a pressure barrier that crushed the flames against the ground and cut them off from oxygen. Shiryu carefully analyzed the result. Even though the fire was fueled by an unknown magical source, and was theoretically impossible to extinguish completely, depriving it of oxygen would stop its advance long enough for them to pass. As dawn slowly broke across the kingdom, Ruby continued praying while watching the magical projection. A sudden movement from Shiryu caught her attention. He signaled to Rina that the path was clear. The raging flames finally held back. Quickly understanding his strategy, Rina suggested they rush through at full speed, earning praise from Shiryu for catching on so quickly. The portal continued shrinking by the second. Realizing they had no time left, Rina lifted him onto her shoulders, their close contact making both of them blush. Shiryu quickly took control, scooping her into his arms to build momentum before sprinting through the opening just moments before it vanished. The spectators erupted in cheers as the pair emerged safely on the other side, but the celebration was short-lived. The second stage of the trial began without warning. The moment they crossed the portal, they were thrown directly into the open ocean. The danger of drowning was immediate, but Shiryu had prepared for exactly this situation. He pulled an inflatable ring from his backpack, keeping both of them afloat as they struggled against the powerful current. Once they stabilized themselves, he pointed toward the horizon. Ahead of them, the sea displayed a terrifying sight. A colossal whirlpool spun with the force of an underwater tornado, completely blocking their path. Remembering the previous trial, Shiryu knew speed would once again be the key to reaching the final stage. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, offering no clue where the exit might be. Remaining calm, Rina closed her eyes and searched for the portal's magical energy, eventually locating it directly beneath the eye of the whirlpool. Evely immediately mocked them, declaring that the vortex would continue expanding until it swallowed them whole. According to her, the mana they had already spent made it impossible for any witch to cross the ocean, especially while carrying someone else. The villagers, however, never stopped believing in the pair. Shiryu understood that optimism alone couldn't overcome the brutal laws of physics. The immense shear forces at the center of that massive whirlpool could tear apart anyone who ventured too close to the rapidly spinning layers of water. Their only chance was to control the whirlpool's flow itself. Rina was visibly exhausted, falling into the same weakened state she had experienced back in the village. Even so, Shiryue encouraged her, convinced she still had enough strength left. He tossed an orange cloth onto the water and carefully observed the current while silently contemplating the insanity of the challenge before them. To him, overcoming something like this felt almost impossible. In the tense silence, Floor and Hinless watched nervously, knowing that if even Shiryue declared the situation impossible, all hope would be lost. Ruby continued praying quietly, watching every second of their desperate battle against the abyss. Although Evely had once wished for Rina's downfall, she was now trembling. The fear of death had overtaken her cruelty, and she bitterly remarked that the goddess seemed to have abandoned them both. Overwhelmed with guilt, Rina apologized to Shiryue for failing to protect him, accepting that dying by his side was at least some comfort. Shiryue, however, rejected her pessimism. The absence of an obvious solution wasn't a death sentence. Pointing upward, he revealed that the exit wasn't at the bottom of the vortex, it was in the sky. Their goal wasn't to dive deeper, but to launch themselves straight out of the trap. Watching from afar, Floor and Hinless struggled to understand his strategy as Shiryue explained that the whirlpool was simply the result of water draining into the portal. The orange cloth he had thrown earlier had been sucked into the vortex and expelled from the top, proving that the bottom and the top were connected by the same current. They simply had to use that force to their advantage. Shiryue encouraged Reina, reminding her there was more than enough water for the maneuver. Filled with confidence, she touched the ocean and poured the rest of her magic into it. As she grabbed his hand, a massive column of water erupted beneath them, launching them violently upward against the current. The transition was shocking. They passed through a strange void between two oceans and emerged into a second sea suspended above them. Then came the real shock. As they crossed the space between the two layers, gravity completely reversed. What had been an upward launch instantly became freefall, and they began plummeting toward the unknown. The impact with the upper ocean was brutal. The force of the water separated them, and Rina, already at the end of her strength, was dragged away by the current. The moment Shiryue saw her sinking unconscious, he didn't hesitate. He dove after her without a second thought. Catching up to her underwater, he immediately realized how critical the situation was and began performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to keep her alive. They finally surfaced, and he carried her onto a nearby rock, continuing CPR. Back outside the projection, the scene caused an uproar. The tension was overwhelming, and some shocked spectators even whispered that Rina's summoned beast was taking advantage of the situation. After several desperate chest compressions, Rina finally coughed up the water and slowly regained consciousness. The unavoidable physical closeness left both of them visibly embarrassed, but Shiryue immediately stepped back, making it clear that his only intention had been to save her life. Rina, focused on completing the trial, refused to let the awkward moment distract her. Shiryue explained that the fall had reversed their gravity, sending them downward, but the currents of the upper ocean had carried them onto the rock, allowing them to bypass the most dangerous underwater section. The villagers erupted in celebration. Their faith in the young strategist and in Rina's divine protection only grew stronger. While Floor and Hinless celebrated how close Rina was to clearing her name, Evely burned with rage at the pair's success. Unable to accept that they had made it this far, she secretly summoned a magical butterfly, preparing her next act of sabotage. Evely released the brilliantly colored illusion butterfly through the portal, watching as it drifted silently toward its target. Meanwhile, Shiryue and Rina searched for a way to continue, completely unaware of the winged threat approaching them. The portal leading to the final stage shimmered within the eye of the hurricane, but reality was cruel. Rina was completely exhausted and would need an entire day to restore her mana time they simply didn't have. Studying the raging storm, Shiryue immediately understood the urgency. As Rina blamed herself for being too weak, he reassured her with a calm smile, explaining that in his world, technology allowed people to fly without relying on magical energy. The audience was split between complete disbelief and overwhelming curiosity. Knowing that the natural obstacles alone would no longer stop the pair, Evely placed all her hopes on the illusion butterfly, convinced it would be the final blow. Completely unaware of the hidden danger, Shiryue began gathering wooden poles and fallen logs scattered across the island. Confused by the simplicity of the materials, Rina questioned whether they would really be enough. Using ropes and scraps of fabric from his backpack, he quietly prepared everything he needed, impressed that the floating island contained so many useful resources despite existing in such an impossible world. The islands floated through the sky as though they defied reality itself. Lost in her thoughts, Rina suddenly saw herself as a child again, floating beneath ancient trees alongside her friends. The memory of awakening her powers years earlier than she should have filled her with the same familiar bitterness. She shook her head and forced the memories away. She refused to let Shiryue carry the burden of the mission alone while she remained trapped in the past. Standing up to help, Rina studied the ground and noticed intricate wind patterns supporting the floating island. Observing the strange markings, Shiryue dismissed the idea that they were random symbols. To him, there was a strict, almost mathematical logic hidden beneath the magic. He couldn't help but admire whoever had designed something so incredibly sophisticated. But hearing him praise that genius reopened Rina's deepest wounds. The trauma of being labeled a dangerous prodigy, isolated by her peers, and marked by her teacher for an awakening ceremony that nearly destroyed her almost froze her in place. Forcing herself back to reality, she pushed those painful memories aside and focused on the present. While she struggled against her past, Shiryue finished building a crude glider designed to convert air currents into lift. The device was finally complete. He called Rina over and told her to pour every last bit of her remaining magical energy into it. The plan was risky but straightforward. Combine that final burst of mana with the glider to ride the wind tunnel and cut straight through the storm in one decisive flight. Rina's hands trembled as they rested on the glider, unable to maintain control. Fear spread through every part of her body, dragging her back into a traumatic memory. She remembered her teacher's lesson and the order to touch the crystal sphere. The brilliant light that burst forth that day had been the beginning of the nightmare. An orange glow filled the room as the other students stood frozen in shock. Then the sky suddenly darkened, and a bolt of lightning shattered a nearby window, sending everyone into a panic. What Rina was feeling now was the echo of that very day, when a demonic beast had appeared in the middle of the city, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. Shiryue tried to intervene, sensing that something was terribly wrong, but he was already too late. Rina had fallen into a trance, crying uncontrollably with her eyes tightly shut. As her teacher desperately tried to stop her, her magical power erupted with overwhelming force, blasting both the boy and the glider several yards away. Through her sobs, Rina whispered an apology to her mother for summoning the monster. Outside the portal, confusion spread everywhere. Ruby desperately searched for answers while Evely pointed at Rina, calling her a heretic and claiming she had finally revealed her true nature. The surge of magical energy stunned everyone present. Merida watched carefully, convinced that the mysterious butterfly that had appeared out of nowhere and the shimmering dust it scattered through the air had triggered the overload. The attempt to contain her failed. The corrupted magic rapidly consumed Rina, transforming her into a being of pure destruction. Clinging to a pillar to keep from being blown away, Shiryue realized that this trial had never truly been meant for her. Surrounded by a violent storm of magical energy, she looked like the final boss of the entire trial, ready to wipe everything off the map. Defeat seemed inevitable, but giving up wasn't an option. Even with discouragement creeping in after everything they had endured, Shiryue saw one last opportunity to apply science and improve the glider. While everyone outside the portal watched in confusion, he crushed dirt with a rock and mixed it with water. The spectators stared in disbelief. In the middle of complete chaos, it looked like nothing more than a child playing in the mud. Shiryue knew that overwhelming force required an intelligent response. He coated the glider with the muddy mixture, creating a shield made from a non-Newtonian fluid. Floor, visibly anxious, doubted that simple mud could withstand Rina's overwhelming power. Without a moment's hesitation, he charged forward. The battlefield had become a wasteland of destruction. Razor-sharp winds and flying rocks shot toward Shiryue like bullets. While Floor and Hinless braced themselves for the worst, the stones slammed into the muddy shield and became completely embedded in it, losing all their momentum. When he reached Rina, only a few feet away, he called out to her. Kneeling on the ground, she looked up at him with a mixture of anguish and confusion. Suddenly, she threw her arms around him and called him by her mother's name. Realizing she was trapped inside a powerful illusion, Shiryue gently held her hand and, understanding the pain of her longing, chose to become the person she needed most to bring her back to reality. Taking on the role of her mother, Shiryue comforted her with unwavering resolve. He explained that her broken state came from unbearable grief, but begged her to listen. The suffering, the beast's attack, her mother's tragic death, and even the drought that struck Caroline were never her fault. They were disasters and tragedies, not the result of her actions. He reminded everyone that Rina had always been a force for good. She hadn't just solved the kingdom's water crisis, she had also saved his life. His plan was simple: stay by her side and help strengthen the people of the kingdom together. With that promise, he asked her to let go of her fear and find peace, assuring her that he would still be there when she woke up. Then he softly began to sing a lullaby. Merida let out a quiet laugh as she recognized the song. Ruby, overcome with emotion, broke down in tears. It was the very same lullaby Rina's mother used to sing to her when she was a little girl. Its lyrics carried a powerful truth. The magical power that attracted danger wasn't a curse, it was a gift. She was the guardian of the land, and her strength had always existed to protect its people. The comforting words of her mother, carried through Shiryue's voice, awakened something deep within her. Rina slowly opened her eyes, tears of relief streaming down her face. She described the feeling as finally waking from an endless dream. As she regained full consciousness, what surprised Shiryue the most was that her magical power hadn't merely stabilized, it had returned stronger than ever before, far surpassing the level it had reached prior to the overload. It was extraordinary potential. The complete restoration of her magic became the key to their survival. Without wasting another second, they clasped hands and, propelled by Rina's renewed power, flew with perfect precision through the eye of the hurricane. With the raging storm finally behind them, the trials had at last come to an end. All that remained was to step through the portal. But what awaited them on the other side left both of them completely stunned. Shiryue was met with a bizarre sight. A towering statue of a goddess floated above a landscape covered by a colossal mountain of monster bones. Even Evely, despite all her experience, was left speechless by what she saw. Ruby pointed out that no one had ever returned alive from this place, explaining why it had remained a complete mystery for so long. At first glance, it looked like an ancient battlefield abandoned by time. Shia immediately pressured the professor, insisting that the trial was over and it was time to deliver the verdict. Backed into a corner, Evely officially announced the result. Shiryue and Reina had passed the divine judgment, proving once and for all that they were not heretics. While everyone focused on the verdict, Shiryue noticed a brilliant light shining from the top of the goddess's statue. Upon investigating, he discovered a massive gemstone. However, before allowing himself to get distracted, he declared that it was time for everyone to return home. Moments later, the teleportation activated, bringing them back. The crowd welcomed them as heroes, cheering loudly for their lady and her summoned companion. But Shiryue still had unfinished business. To everyone's surprise, he took Rina's hand and confidently walked straight toward Evely. Standing before the crowd, he declared that Rina's victory in the goddess's trial was the final and undeniable proof that every accusation of heresy had been nothing more than a lie. Shiryue refused to back down. Standing his ground, he not only confronted Evely, but demanded that she publicly apologize to both the people of Caroline and to his lady. The pressure became so overwhelming that the once unshakable woman began showing obvious signs of nervousness as the crowd rallied behind Shiryue's demand. Rina tried to step in, but Evely, still clinging to what remained of her authority, refused to completely surrender. Speaking with open contempt, she declared that the matter would be settled in the royal capital, making it clear she had no intention of admitting defeat. Shiryue, however, was nowhere near satisfied. Furious at the teacher's arrogance, he finally let loose. Without missing the opportunity, he called out the hypocrisy of those who invoked divine authority whenever they wanted to win an argument, only to hide behind excuses when both logic and strength failed them. His sharp criticism even served as a lesson for the children watching nearby, warning them about the disgraceful behavior of people like her. Rina tried to calm him down, but he simply remarked that, at long last, the nightmare was finally over. Floor and Hinless came running over, showering Shiryue with praise. After all, he had accomplished the impossible, surviving the goddess's trial. The boy's ego visibly swelled from their compliments. Rina, on the other hand, quietly watched from a cautious distance. Meanwhile, the people of Caroline, deeply impressed by the devotion and self-sacrifice Shiryue had shown throughout the trial, had already begun whispering that perhaps his place wasn't merely beside Rina as her summoned companion, but as her future prince consort. The public's support was unmistakable, and rumors about a possible kiss or embrace quickly spread through the crowd. Completely caught off guard, Shiryue asked how everyone knew such private details. Ruby solved the mystery by explaining that the projection spell had broadcast the entire divine judgment live, allowing the entire city to witness every moment. Surprised by how advanced that technology was, Shiryue joked that if he'd known he had such a huge audience, he would have performed like a professional streamer. The mood immediately shifted as people bombarded them with questions about their wedding date. While Shiryue struggled to process the situation, Rina stood nearby with a shy smile and bright red cheeks. The overwhelming pressure from the crowd left neither of them with any escape. Later, while reflecting on everything that had happened, Shiryue realized that although the original goal had been proving Rina's innocence, the trial had ultimately tied both of their destinies together in the eyes of the entire kingdom. The awkwardness between them became painfully real. After everything they had been through, they could barely exchange a few words without looking away. Rina's quiet, "Good morning," became the only break in the uncomfortable silence. Feeling overwhelmed by everyone's expectations, Shiryue retreated to his workshop. Surrounded by his tools, his thoughts drifted back to the gemstone he had found atop the goddess's statue. He had instructed Rina to take it because the patterns carved into it looked strangely familiar. They matched the same structure found on the floating islands. Shiryue became convinced that if he could decipher the logic behind that gemstone, he would be one step closer to creating his own levitation technology. Shiryu's concentration was interrupted when Floor and Hinless arrived for their lesson. He quickly slipped the gemstone into his pocket before they noticed. Floor wasted no time getting to the point. She announced that, now that everyone had heard about their success, a large group of young witches had come offering generous amounts of gold in exchange for private lessons with him. Despite how beautiful the applicants were, the only thing that truly caught Shiryue's attention was the mountain of gold they were offering. He gladly accepted the proposal, thinking with a grin that, even in another world, he'd somehow ended up making money by selling online courses. The peace during the lesson didn't last long. One of the new witches openly asked when Rina's wedding would be. Floor tried to shut the gossip down, but the girl insisted, claiming she only wanted enough time to prepare a proper gift. Shiryue felt like a stranger in his own story, unable to understand why everyone seemed so certain about something that was still a complete surprise to him. The following day, the mood shifted dramatically during a meeting with Shia and Rina. The blonde brought troubling news. Years of failed harvests, combined with mounting taxes, had put Caroline directly under the royal family's scrutiny. If the situation wasn't turned around before the next cabinet meeting, the queen would strip Rina of her title, removing her as the feudal lord of Caroline. Shiryue, who had already heard rumors about the food shortage, was stunned by how severe the crisis had become. Chia explained the situation in detail. The spring equinox marked the deadline for Caroline's annual performance report to the queen. Since Ruby, who had governed in Rina's absence, had failed to meet the agricultural quotas for 3 consecutive years, the future of both Rina and the entire territory was hanging by a thread. Even if they somehow managed to pay off the overdue taxes, restoring agricultural production in such a short time was impossible. Chia then suggested that Shiryue accompany her, but he immediately grabbed her by the arm and made it clear he wasn't changing his mind. He bluntly stated that he wasn't a man who could be bought and warned her that touching him without permission would have consequences. Rather than getting offended, Chia simply laughed, finding his reaction oddly amusing. Shiryue asked why she had returned after being seen alongside Evely. Chia explained that the council had departed to investigate the mysterious area discovered at the end of the divine judgment, while she had remained behind under direct royal orders to pressure Caroline into meeting its tax and agricultural obligations. Chia fell into a brief, thoughtful silence, but Shiryue had already stopped paying attention. He turned toward Rina and declared that, as the Minister of Science, it was time to get to work. He joked that even though the two of them had grown close, he still expected to receive his salary because he needed to save money for his future wedding. Surprised, Rina asked who he planned to marry, but he completely ignored the question, keeping his attention fixed on Caroline's financial crisis. Back at the castle, Shiryue and Reina met with Ruby. What had initially appeared to be a problem caused solely by the drought turned out, after Shiryue's technical analysis, to be something much deeper. The real cause behind the collapsing harvests was the steady loss of arable farmland year after year. Shiryue focused on Emerald City, a region that had once produced nearly 60% of all the area's crops. Its decline had started almost a decade earlier and eventually led to a complete shutdown of farming 5 years ago. When he asked Ruby what had caused it, she insisted the land was cursed beyond repair and had resisted every purification attempt. Exhausted by hearing about endless disasters and supposed curses, Shiryue sarcastically compared the situation to something straight out of a ridiculous video game. Determined to uncover the truth, he proposed an expedition to Emerald City. Ruby immediately refused to let Rina join, arguing that she was far too important to put in danger. Frustrated by their secrecy and evasive behavior, Shiryue left the room without realizing it had all been part of a carefully planned setup. The moment he was gone, Ruby completely changed her tone. She pressured Rina to move quickly and propose marriage. According to Ruby, everything between the two had changed after the divine judgment, and if Rina didn't make their relationship official, people would begin questioning her honor. In Ruby's eyes, Rina needed to act decisively before the rumors became damaging. Rina hesitated, afraid of forcing Shiryue into something he might not truly want, but Ruby refused to let up, reminding her that time was running out and that, deep down, her feelings for him were completely genuine. Torn between duty and the fear of rejection, Rina found herself cornered by the urgency to decide her future before politics destroyed her position. Rina finally stopped denying her feelings. Blushing intensely, she admitted that she had fallen for Shiryue. Satisfied with the confession, Ruby encouraged her to take action. According to her, men enjoy being pursued, and Rina should win him over with thoughtful gifts and heartfelt surprises. Ruby's warning that other young women were already interested in Shiryue, and that the competition wouldn't wait, was the final push Rina needed. The realization that he had become so popular caught her completely off guard, putting her on high alert. Meanwhile, Shiryue made his way through the forest alongside Floor and Hinless. An uneasy feeling that someone was watching him refused to go away, leading him to suspect that Rina was secretly following them. He even tried to brush it off as wishful thinking born from missing her, but his instincts were right. Hidden beneath a cloak, Rina quietly watched the group's every move. The mood shifted when they stopped to rest and prepare something to eat. As they peeled potatoes, Floor and Hinless got straight to the point. Floor confidently declared that Shiryue would never marry Reina and insisted that the fact he had chosen to travel alone with them was a clear sign of interest. In her eyes, it was time to make the first move. Men were always too shy to do it themselves, so it was up to her to give him the green light. Completely oblivious to the romantic expectations surrounding him, Shiryue was focused on the expedition's logistics. Rina's territory was so poor that they only had a single wagon, forcing everyone to march for miles on foot. After half a day of hiking under the blazing sun, the lack of inns or even basic shelters along the road made the journey even more exhausting. That was when Floor decided to make her move. Trying to act casual, she offered Shiryue a flower as a gift. His response, however, was the complete opposite of what she expected. Instead of being charmed, he grabbed her cheeks and squeezed them while casually holding a hammer in his other hand. He bluntly reminded her that this was a work trip, not a romantic getaway. Floor immediately ran over to Hinless in tears, completely bewildered, asking why he hadn't reacted like a normal man. More perceptive than ever, Hinless simply replied that Shiryue was anything but normal. By nightfall, completely worn out after listening to Floor chatter nonstop all day, Shiryue retreated to his tent. His headache was relentless, but as he tried to relax, his thoughts drifted to Rina. He found himself comparing her calm elegance to the constant chaos caused by his traveling companions, deciding that Rina's gentle personality was infinitely more charming. With that thought in mind, he quietly fell asleep. Morning brought an unexpected surprise. When Shiryu woke up, he found a beautiful bouquet of roses beside his bed. Stepping outside the tent, he asked who had left the flowers there. Watching the scene unfold, Floor immediately jumped to the wrong conclusion. Since only the three of them were camping there, she confidently claimed the flowers must have been his own attempt to get her attention. Completely convinced by her theory, she placed a hand on his shoulder. Shiryue instantly brushed it away, ready to put an end to the misunderstanding with a brutally honest response. Instead, Shiryue ignored Floor entirely and walked straight toward the tree where Rina was hiding. Without wasting a second, he asked her to come out and rescue him from Floor's relentless advances, admitting that he had sensed her presence from the very beginning. He confessed that the moment he found the roses, he knew without a doubt they had come from her. Meanwhile, a stunned and thoroughly embarrassed Floor received a lecture from Hinless, who told her to stop living in her own fantasies. At last, the group arrived at Emerald City. Looking visibly nostalgic, Rina explained how important that place had once been. Thanks to a triple cropping system and an outstanding irrigation network developed by her mother alongside Mayor Line, the city had once produced over 1,700 tons of crops every harvest. She fondly recalled the days when the farmers worked together in harmony beneath the warm March sun. The reality before them, however, was nothing short of a nightmare. The townspeople wandered the streets like lifeless ghosts, their eyes completely devoid of hope. The moment they spotted Rina's group, shock spread across their faces before they fled in complete panic. Completely confused, Shiryue watched the bizarre scene unfold, joking that they must have seen a ghost because no normal person would react with that much terror. The mystery didn't last long. Before long, the villagers returned, but this time they were carrying something, or rather someone. They brought a young girl on their shoulders as if she were an offering, gently placing her on the ground in front of Rina and Shiryue. Then, every single villager dropped to their knees in desperate unison, begging for help. Their city stood on the edge of collapse, and only the two of them could save it. The group quickly realized that news of the divine judgment had reached Emerald City, inspiring the desperate villagers to seek Rina's help. Shiryue, however, initially interpreted the scene rather differently, wondering if the girl they had carried over was some kind of bizarre sacrifice. The tension vanished almost instantly when the little girl ran straight into Rina's arms, calling her Lady Rina, while tearfully lamenting the 9 years they had been apart. She was Line, the mayor of Emerald City, and she had brought devastating news. Emerald City was slowly dying under the rule of a plague-spreading magical beast. The land that had once been incredibly fertile had become cursed, and anyone who consumed its crops slowly suffered corruption of both body and mind. Isolation had become unavoidable. Fearing the disease would spread, the neighboring villages had sealed themselves off, abandoning Line's people to their fate as they waited for the inevitable collapse of their minds. Meanwhile, as Line described the town's desperate situation, Shiryue noticed something that didn't match the signs of a mystical curse. A dog, covered in sores, was desperately lapping up the local water. He immediately picked it up and loudly declared that he doubted the illness had any supernatural origin. Maintaining a hostile attitude, Line quickly scolded him, ordering him to stay quiet since he knew nothing about curses. The mayor's arrogance immediately irritated Shiryue. While she treated Rina with complete respect and submission, the way she spoke to him was demanding and condescending. Offended by her attitude, Shiryue declared that he wouldn't lift a finger, leaving the entire investigation and every attempt at finding a cure entirely in Rina's hands. Rina admitted she had no idea how to solve the problem, but Shiryue gently took her hand and assured her the solution was actually simple. Following his instructions, she summoned flames exceeding 10,000 degrees over a sample of soil. As Floor intensified the fire, a nauseating odor filled the air. Rina was surprised by the ground's unusual resistance, almost as if something beneath the surface was pushing back against the intense heat. A few minutes later, the smoke turned a deep purple. Fascinated by the color, Floor started complimenting it, but Shiryue abruptly cut her off, ordering her to use wind magic to disperse the gas before everyone lost their minds from inhaling it. She whined in protest, accusing him of being reckless since he had already been exposed to the toxic fumes, and if she went insane, he'd be the first person she'd attack. Once the smoke finally cleared, Hinless examined the scorched soil. Shiryue wasted no time. Picking up a stone from the burned debris, he confidently announced that the mystery had been solved. It wasn't a curse at all, it was severe heavy metal contamination, specifically iron and manganese. Still skeptical, Line mocked his scientific explanation, suggesting he was only trying to impress everyone with complicated terminology. Irritated by her arrogance, Shiryue answered without hesitation. He compared the land to the human body, explaining that if someone swallowed that rock, they would slowly suffer from heavy metal poisoning. Looking her straight in the eye, he challenged her, asking whether even such a simple comparison was still too difficult for her to understand. Line dismissed him with open contempt, arguing that it made no difference whether the land was poisoned or cursed. Shiryue immediately fired back, explaining that the distinction was everything. A curse was beyond his reach, but heavy metal poisoning was something he actually knew how to eliminate. His answer left the mayor speechless, while Floor and Hinless exchanged satisfied smiles, once again impressed by his brilliance. Annoyed, Line grabbed Rina by the arm, pulling her away while grumbling that Shiryue only knew how to flirt and lacked the qualities of a proper husband. Shiryue tried to protest, but Line shifted the conversation toward politics, questioning Rina about Caroline's agricultural quotas. Speaking in a smug, condescending tone, she declared that even if Emerald City returned to its record harvest of 1,720 tons, it still wouldn't come close to the required target of 4,200 tons. She advised them to give up altogether, treating Shiryue with complete disdain. That was the final straw. Losing his patience, Shiryue explained that the region's farming system supported 3 harvests each year. By combining the June planting with the September and December harvests, and with assistance from neighboring towns, the production goal was entirely achievable. He He openly called Line a hypocritical old woman and told her to get out of his way, making it clear that her incompetence would never define his limits. Just as the argument was about to turn physical, Rina stepped between them. She firmly declared that Shiryue was her minister of science and that she wouldn't allow anyone to lay a hand on him. Her protective tone and unwavering stance filled Shiryue with happiness. Line, however, refused to back down. Tightening her grip on Rina's arm, she insisted that the spring planting season was unmatched and that any alternative plan would only waste time and resources. Line continued insisting that the production target was nothing but a fantasy and that the soil could never recover in such a short amount of time. Standing his ground, Shiryue gently took Rina's arm, reaffirming his complete confidence in the plan. To keep the conflict from escalating any further, the two sides reluctantly settled on a temporary truce with a forced handshake, choosing to prioritize Emerald City's future over their personal hostility. After settling into a temporary residence, Floor handled all the preparations with remarkable efficiency. Clearly impressed, Shiryue openly praised her, saying how valuable it was to have someone so capable by his side. Floor responded with a teasing remark about just how indispensable she was. The exchange, filled with obvious flirting, did not go unnoticed by Rina, who silently remembered Ruby's warnings about Shiryue's growing popularity and the need to make her move before someone else did. Acting on a sudden impulse, Rina tugged gently on Shiryue's jacket. In a quiet, shy voice, she asked if there was anything she could do to help him. Genuinely touched by her sincerity, Shiryue admitted that simply having her by his side was already the greatest support he could ask for. The unexpected answer left Rina both confused and blushing deeply. Clearing his throat in an attempt to ease the awkwardness, he finally admitted that there actually was an important task he needed her to handle. Shiryu gathered the witches at the temporary base and unveiled his restoration project. The focus was soil remediation, a method designed to decontaminate the land and eliminate environmental hazards. The plan was both technical and sustainable, a closed-loop cleanup system that relied on earthworms to restore the biological health of the poisoned soil. The plan required Rina to use her authority as the territory's ruler to manipulate the soil's microbiota, but it immediately hit an unexpected obstacle, a drawing of an earthworm. Rina, Floor, and Hinless stared at the sketch in complete confusion. Even though Rina remembered playing in the dirt as a child, she had never seen a creature like that. Frustrated, Shiryu questioned the villagers, but the result was the same: no one had ever heard of an earthworm. Shiryu searched the entire property, digging through the ground while the girls watched with amused disgust, convinced that his obsession with hunting worms in the mud was both bizarre and revolting. After returning to their quarters and cleaning up, he admitted he was genuinely shocked. He couldn't believe an ecosystem could exist without earthworms. Trying to understand, Rina asked why that little creature was so important. Shiryu explained that without industrial chemicals to remove heavy metal contamination, earthworms were the only biological engine capable of processing the toxic waste underground. Without them filtering the soil and water, restoring the farmland in time for the fall planting season would be impossible. Frustrated as his plan seemed to fall apart, Shiryu lamented the absence of nature's decomposers. Staying calm, Rina consulted her personal encyclopedia. After reading that those organisms preferred dark, damp environments, she proposed an unusual alternative, using slimes instead, since they thrived under similar conditions and might fill the same ecological role. The encyclopedia's description of how those creatures digested organic matter sparked an idea. Hope returning, Shiryu and Rina set out that night for a nearby cave known to be home to slimes. At the entrance, Shiryu took Rina's hand to guide her across the slippery ground, and together they disappeared into the darkness. Though she tried to stay composed, her nervousness was obvious. It didn't take long before they spotted movement along the damp cave walls. Shiryu acted immediately, catching a slime with a prepared net as skillfully as if he were catching frogs, then sealing it inside a container. He insisted that Rina try it too, assuring her it would be fun. She hesitated, worried her magic might harm such delicate creatures, but he explained that she didn't need magic, just good timing. Shiryu stepped closer to show her how, and the sudden closeness left Rina completely flustered. Gathering her courage, she reached for another slime, but it dodged her with what almost looked like a mocking move. The slime let out a bubbling sound before suddenly launching itself straight at her. Rina froze, realizing her magical reflexes weren't fast enough to react. Just before impact, Shiryu grabbed her arm, pulled her out of the way, shielded her with his own body, and delivered a powerful kick that sent the slime flying, knocking it out instantly with a loud battle cry. Breathing heavily, he quickly turned back to make sure she wasn't hurt. Rina couldn't say a single word. Her face was bright red, her heart racing from both the scare and how close they had been. After the tense silence inside the cave, they returned to Emerald City at sunrise. Everyone had been waiting anxiously, and Shiryu arrived dragging a large sack filled with the slimes they had captured. Facing the villagers' skeptical stares, he announced that those creatures would be the key to purifying the soil. Laughter and mocking comments spread through the crowd. No one believed an ordinary monster could succeed where an ancient curse had failed. Shiryu ignored the criticism. He spread a sample of the contaminated soil across a wooden board and placed one of the slimes on top of it. After briefly inspecting its surroundings, the creature began devouring the poisoned earth with surprising enthusiasm. While the villagers continued making sarcastic remarks, Floor watched every movement with growing excitement. Moments later, the slime expelled the processed material. Unable to think of a better description, Floor excitedly shouted that the slime had pooped, drawing nervous laughter from everyone nearby. Hinless stepped forward to inspect the material and noticed something remarkable. Mixed with the processed soil was a limestone-like mineral. Rina noticed an even more obvious change. The dull, lifeless earth had turned into a healthy color, and the foul odor that once filled the air had completely disappeared. Tears welled up in her eyes as overwhelming relief washed over her. The villagers, who had doubted Shiryu moments earlier, now looked at the restored soil with awe, whispering that only someone who had survived the goddess's trial could perform such a practical miracle for their people. The entire town erupted in celebration. Emerald City, once trapped in despair, finally had hope for a prosperous future. Shiryu updated his diagram, replacing earthworms with slimes, and estimated that if they maintained the current pace, the land would be ready for farming in just 3 months. The immediate success, however, had one unexpected side effect. Overwhelmed with excitement, Floor threw herself into Shiryu's arms, hugging him tightly, while declaring that he was nothing short of a divine being. Rina reacted instantly. The calm expression on her face vanished, replaced by a sharp, serious look. She stepped forward, reached out, and tapped Shiryu, who immediately got the message. He gently pulled away from Floor and made a point of giving Rina full credit for the slime idea, making sure everyone knew the success of the project was thanks to her. The acknowledgement made the blonde beam with happiness. Floor showed no sign of jealousy. Instead, she joined in, praising both of them as if they were divine beings. Line, however, quickly brought everyone back to reality. After checking the numbers, she revealed there were fewer than 500 slimes left in the area. At that rate, completely restoring the land would take more than a year. Floor then proposed a solution, pointing out that the neighboring territory of Oboga was rich in lakes and wetlands, making it home to thousands of additional slimes. The expansion plan, however, immediately met resistance. A local villager who overheard the conversation voiced his outrage. To him, the idea of Shiryu crossing into a neighboring territory to capture slimes creatures they considered part of their local resources was completely unacceptable. The celebration quickly turned into an unexpected diplomatic dispute, leaving the Minister of Science facing a political dilemma. The messenger hurried to thank Lady Esther for acting ahead of schedule before rushing to Oboga. He found her relaxing in a private bath, earning an immediate scolding for interrupting her leisure time. Esther's irritation vanished, however, when he explained that Caroline intended to use slimes to purify contaminated farmland. At first, she dismissed the idea as harmless, but her attitude changed the moment she learned they planned to enter her territory to capture the creatures. Esther leaped out of the bath in outrage. To her, every inch of her land from the dust beneath her feet to the air above it was private property. Sensing her anger, the messenger skillfully played to her pride, warning that allowing them to take slimes today could eventually lead to outsiders helping themselves to even more valuable resources. After quickly covering herself, Esther became convinced her property was under threat and immediately ordered her servant to buy every slime available in the towns surrounding Caroline. Her strategy was simple and driven by greed: corner the market. She knew that once people realized slimes had monetary value, everyone would start capturing them. That would leave Shiryu with no natural supply, forcing him to buy the creatures directly from Oboga and turning Caroline's desperation into her personal profit. Esther considered how the public would react. People would undoubtedly call her crazy for spending tax money on slimes, unable to understand her long-term strategy. Unconcerned by public opinion, she handed her subordinate the key to her private vault and ordered him to spend everything inside acquiring as many slimes as possible. The trap had been set. Esther had no issue using her personal fortune, carefully keeping it separate from the city's public treasury. When her servant suggested using his own savings instead, she smacked him on the head for such a ridiculous idea. She urged him to hurry, warning that Caroline's success would become a direct threat to her own territory. Left alone, Esther reflected on the princess's unexpected decision to remain in those lands after surviving the goddess's trial. Something or someone there had clearly captured her attention. Meanwhile, Shiryu's group arrived at Boxy Lake, confident they would find it crawling with slimes. Instead, they were greeted by a biological wasteland. There wasn't a single trace of life. Both Shiryu and Floor stood there in disbelief, struggling to understand why the creatures had completely vanished. The mystery didn't last long. A local hunter appeared carrying a single slime and immediately offered it for sale. Horrified, Hinless learned that a slime-catching frenzy had swept across the region. As soon as buyers appeared, countless hunters rushed in, wiping out the area's entire natural slime population in a single afternoon. Always optimistic, Floor suggested simply buying the slimes instead of hunting them. Shiryu immediately covered her mouth, stopping her before she could say anything else. He quietly analyzed the situation. Someone had predicted his next move and deliberately begun stockpiling the creatures to manipulate the market. His soil restoration project was now at risk of being sabotaged through price speculation. Looking seriously at Floor, he asked whether she honestly thought they had enough money to compete in such an inflated market. Frustration spread through the group. With the local supply wiped out by speculation, restoring the farmland seemed like an impossible dream, and the villagers began fearing for the next harvest. Shiryu, however, refused to give up. He ordered everyone back to base and instructed them to conduct a thorough search for any slimes that might have escaped the mass capture. Back at their temporary headquarters, uncertainty filled the air. As Rina carefully considered the problem, she searched for a logical solution. She eventually found Shiryu carrying a single slime, convinced she had discovered the answer to their shortage. With incredible precision, she concentrated magical energy into her fingertips and sliced the creature cleanly in half. She explained that, thanks to the slime's remarkable regenerative abilities, cutting it apart wouldn't kill it, it would simply force each half to regenerate into a separate individual. The look in Shiryu's eyes confirmed that Rina's intuition had been exactly right. Reproduction through division was the perfect biological solution for rapidly multiplying their natural soil purifiers. Overjoyed, he pulled her into a warm hug, praising her brilliance. The unexpected closeness made Rina blush bright red, but this time she overcame her shyness, returned the embrace, and softly suggested that he finally take a moment to relax after everything they had been through that day. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the arrival of Floor and Hinless. Never one to hold back, Floor immediately teased the protagonist, comparing his initiative to the laziness of ordinary men. The atmosphere between Shiryu and Rina changed instantly. They quickly stepped away from each other, though the glance they exchanged made it obvious that something new had begun to grow between them. Without wasting any time, the group placed the two slime halves on a workbench. Curious to test the limits of the process, Floor suggested repeatedly dividing them until they had 16 tiny specimens. With remarkable speed and precision, she eagerly took over, determined to turn the original pair into an entire workforce. Floor enthusiastically sliced the slimes over and over until they became countless tiny pieces. When she asked whether the result was satisfactory, Shiryu admitted, with a slightly uncomfortable expression, that watching her casually chop living creatures into pieces was more than a little disturbing. Floor immediately accused him of being a hypocrite, but Shiryu ignored the jab. His concern was purely practical. Multiplying them 16-fold solved the population shortage, although another technical issue still remained. Meanwhile, back in Oboga, Lady Esther was peacefully enjoying tea in her garden, feeling triumphant after cornering the slime market. Her victory was short-lived. A servant rushed in with alarming news. Caroline had ignored her monopoly and had begun producing slimes artificially. The revelation shocked Esther so badly that she spit her tea directly into the man's face. The news was devastating. The enormous stockpile she had purchased with her own fortune had become worthless overnight. As she mourned the mountain of gold she had wasted on her failed scheme, Esther vented her frustration on her servant. He defended himself, reminding her that he had once offered to help cover part of the expense, only for her to reject the idea because she had been convinced the investment would make her even richer. Now, the regret came far too late. Meanwhile, in Caroline, things were unfolding very differently. Rina handed a pouch filled with gold coins to Merida. After checking its contents, Merida questioned why she was being given such a large sum. Remaining calm in her office, Rina explained that their interests now aligned. Ever the businesswoman, Merida replied that she never accepted gifts without a clear purpose. Every valuable asset, in her view, needed a business justification. Merida questioned why a princess was behaving like a market speculator, but Rina's response was brief and simple: cooperate or stay out of the way. With no time for further debate, everyone returned to the technical challenge at hand. Dividing the slimes into 16 smaller bodies had significantly reduced each one's filtering ability. Shiryu and Rina agreed to solve the issue by producing even more slimes, and the dedication they showed toward working together sounded to Floor and Hinless like something far more intimate than a simple scientific partnership. Their routine was interrupted when a villager announced the arrival of important visitors. A group had entered the village transporting massive shipments of slimes from Oboga. Everyone was stunned when the leader stepped forward and revealed herself to be Lady Esther. The moment she spotted Rina, Esther pretended they were longtime friends, greeting her with exaggerated warmth. Line immediately exposed the act, pointing out that the two clearly didn't know each other at all. Esther smoothly brushed it aside by complimenting Rina's famous reputation. The mood shifted when Esther turned toward Shiryu. With an elegant, theatrical gesture, she took his hand and kissed it as though greeting a nobleman at a royal court. The display immediately infuriated Floor, who saw yet another woman falling for Shiryu. Rina, finally losing her patience with the prolonged contact, stepped in, physically pulled Shiryu's hand away from Esther, and formally introduced everyone. Esther claimed she had come purely out of kindness to help Caroline overcome its resource shortage, proudly presenting the enormous shipment of slimes she had collected. Shiryu, however, wasn't fooled by her sudden generosity. He immediately noticed the obvious contradiction. Esther somehow knew exactly what resources they needed long before their plans had become public, making him suspect she had either been spying on them or was playing a much larger political game. Esther wasted no time emphasizing her financial sacrifice, claiming she had emptied her own personal fortune solely to help Rina. Feeling indebted, Rina immediately began thinking of a way to repay her, but Shiryu calmly interrupted. With measured confidence, he explained that thanks to their discovery of slime reproduction through division, Esther's shipment was no longer necessary. Although she tried to hide the blow, Shiryu's refusal to treat her donation as an act of charity visibly rattled her. Shiryu thanked her politely, but explained that accepting such a massive shipment for free would only create unnecessary obligations. Reading between the lines, Rina immediately supported his position, announcing that Caroline would simply continue multiplying its own slimes, while Esther dealt with the enormous surplus she had purchased herself. Rina's complete trust in Shiryu and the way she carefully followed his lead deeply intrigued Esther. Watching him closely, she tried to understand what kind of influence he held over someone like Rina, ultimately deciding that he was a man who deserved a thorough investigation. Realizing the donation had become a burden instead of a tool for control, Esther tried to force the issue, suggesting that if they wouldn't accept them, the creatures should simply be released. Seeing through her scheme, Shiryu let out a sigh and gave in, agreeing to take the slimes under the reasoning that they would be extra help, not something they desperately needed. His air of superiority infuriated Esther on the inside, but she kept up her facade. To seal the deal, Shiryu turned the downside of the divided creatures against her, reminding her with a hint of sarcasm that, since she was there to help, she should also take responsibility for the technical consequences of her supposedly generous gesture. The territory of Oboga was chosen as the perfect breeding ground for the creatures, though the responsibility for maintaining them fell on the group. Despite her reluctance and obvious discomfort during the negotiations, Esther had no choice but to honor the promise that sealed their arrangement. As soon as the visitor left, Shiryu exposed the truth. To him, it was obvious that Esther had intended to manipulate them, pretending to be an ally while looking down on them. He had no intention of letting that trick slide. She needed to be taught a harsh lesson. Watching from afar, Esther's assistant had to admit that the creature Rina had summoned was frighteningly perceptive. Even though they knew those creatures were essential, they had been cornered and forced to compromise. The atmosphere grew heavy as suspicion spread that the group's only goal was to exploit Oboga's resources. There was a shared sense of frustration that they had failed to escape the clutches of such opportunists. Even while facing accusations of bankruptcy and desperation, Esther insisted her fortune hadn't disappeared. She swore she would recover every single coin from the second princess. The people around her found it hard to believe, seeing the royal family as far too clever to fall for such an obvious scam. Esther then revealed her trump card. A consultation with a local farmer had taught her that, while the slimes purified the soil, they also drained its fertility. Her plan was simple and ruthless. By feeding the creatures that contaminated material, the land would eventually become a barren wasteland. With crop production collapsing, The princess would have no choice but to pay for the damage in order to protect her own investment. As Esther watched Shiryu, she realized that beneath his ordinary appearance was the mind of a brilliant strategist. More than defeating him, she found herself wanting him as an ally, knowing that having an intellect like his on her side would completely change the rules of the game. The story then shifted to the Fano Chamber of Commerce. There, Ceciliane, the influential assistant to the princess and Merida's older sister, made her orders perfectly clear. She pressured her younger sister to cut off financial support and put the family's interests above everything else. As soon as Ceciliane left, Merida examined an invitation from Rina. Something about it gave her a bad feeling, as if the air itself carried the tension of an approaching disaster. Far away, Rina and Shiryu monitored the slimes as they slowly purified the contaminated land. Rina couldn't hide her anxiety, fearing that Merida might back out. Shiryu, however, remained calm, pointing out that the arrival of her carriage proved the negotiations were about to begin. When Merida arrived in Emerald City, she wasted no time. Impressed by how much the town had changed, she ignored Rina's formal greetings and demanded they get straight to the issue that mattered: Caroline's tax crisis. The speed with which she assessed the situation surprised Shiryu, making him realize he was dealing with a ruthless negotiator. Without any small talk, the redhead demanded to know the price of the meeting. Shiryu immediately offered his liquid nitrogen technology. While he tried to anticipate her every move, Merida dismissed the proposal with open hostility. She downplayed the value of artificial rainfall, pointing out that she already commanded an entire legion of water witches, then delivered her ultimatum. If they didn't have something truly indispensable, she had no intention of wasting another second there. Merida's arrogant attitude led her to dismiss the offer before even hearing the details. She turned her back and walked toward her carriage, but Shiryu made no move to stop her. Instead, he calmly delivered a sharp warning. Leaving now would be a fatal mistake. Walking away would cost her a fortune, handing her rivals, who had once been far behind, a permanent advantage in the marketplace. While that battle of wills unfolded outside, the atmosphere inside the workshop was completely different. Floor and Hinless guided a group of witches through the details of the liquid nitrogen system. Floor explained how the mechanism, one of Cheapo's exclusive inventions, forced rainfall to occur. The visiting witches were stunned when they examined the device and realized it contained no magic whatsoever. It wasn't an enchanted artifact, but a completely new piece of technology. That discovery elevated Shiryu's reputation to an almost legendary status in their eyes. To boost her mentor's image even further, Floor proudly showed off a watch she kept close to her body, with a picture of Shiryu inside. She bragged about his extraordinary intelligence, pointing out that even someone as experienced as Rina struggled to keep up with the way he thought. When they were asked about the true purpose behind the artificial rain, Hinless explained that it went far beyond simple irrigation. They were there to introduce a nitrogen-based fertilizer, a compound capable of producing abundant and reliable harvests. The revelation left the witches speechless, comparing the achievement to the power of a harvest goddess. Even so, a few of them remained skeptical, unwilling to believe something so revolutionary could actually work. Floor broke into a cold sweat as she tried to stall the audience. She insisted she had the production of the mysterious gas under control, claiming that all that remained was a final adjustment so the plants could absorb the mixture properly. The pressure for clear answers left her cornered, silently praying for someone to save her. That rescue arrived with Shiryu. Getting straight to the point, he revealed that the key was hidden in the air itself, an invisible, odorless element capable of changing everything. With a simple nod to Rina, the demonstration began. Using magic, she split water molecules apart, isolating the hydrogen. Then, with a magical spark from her fingertips, she triggered an intense reaction. The gases combined to form ammonia, which was rapidly cooled into a powerful liquid. The immediate impact on the crops couldn't be proven on the spot, but Shiryu confidently made his promise. Emerald City would become the ultimate showcase for this breakthrough. The group of witches struggled to understand the scientific explanation, but what they had witnessed shattered any lingering doubts. The achievement was nothing short of incredible. Watching from the sidelines, Merida carefully observed how effortlessly Shiryu won over the audience. A victorious smile was already beginning to form between Shiryu and Rina, but the redhead's business-minded instincts led her in a different direction. Unable to grasp the full potential of the technology, she declined to buy the invention. Instead, she countered with a massive loan to solve Caroline's tax crisis, tied to outrageously predatory interest rates. Floor finally understood why Merida had such a fearsome reputation as a merchant. While Rina struggled to calculate the terms of the agreement, Shiryu finished the math first. His conclusion was brutal. Signing that contract would leave them owing 3 times the original amount within just 12 months. It wasn't financial assistance. It was a death sentence. His answer came without hesitation. Bluntly, Shiryu told the redhead to find someone else to rob. At that moment, Floor's admiration for the merchant completely disappeared, replaced by disgust as she saw the exploitative woman behind the polished image. Merida remained unfazed. Calmly, she offered another deal alone with 0 interest, asking only for a small favor in return. The trap was obvious. Sensing the danger, Shiryu ended the discussion and pulled the negotiator aside for a private conversation, leaving everyone else on high alert. Away from curious eyes, the bombshell finally dropped. That so-called small favor was anything but small. The redhead wanted to force him into a marriage. The proposal hit Shiryu like a truck, leaving him completely speechless. Once the shock wore off, he admitted it was a bold move, but immediately rejected it. He turned the offer down on the spot and declared that he would seek funding from other investors. Merida's response crushed every possible escape route. She made it perfectly clear that no sane merchant would finance his project because doing business with him would mean declaring war on her family, the region's greatest economic power. She hadn't come there for fun. Her ultimatum was absolute. Either he accepted the loan with its crushing interest rates or agreed to the marriage alliance. If he chose his pride instead, she would use the full weight of her family's empire to destroy both his business and Caroline's economy until nothing remained. Merida's audacity irritated Shiryu, who asked whether she had made the trip solely to threaten him. Cold and calculating, the redhead replied that a real merchant never enters a deal expecting to lose money, and the determination in her eyes made it clear she wasn't bluffing. What Shiryu didn't know was the political game unfolding behind the scenes. Princess Sia had already explained that financing Caroline would help Merida achieve her own goals. However, her family's leadership had forbidden any assistance because their true objective was to bring down Rina's rule. Keeping that internal conflict hidden, Merida simply argued that the price she demanded was small compared to the target she would place on her own back by defying her superiors. She knew Caroline's financial desperation outweighed any sense of pride. Refusing to back down, Shiryu asked for 3 days, declaring that he would show her something capable of shattering her assumptions and completely turning the situation around. Outside in the hallway, Floor had her ear pressed against the thick door, frustrated that she couldn't make out a single word. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Shiryu caught the eavesdropper red-handed with a piercing glare. Completely shameless, Floor ignored his silent scolding and immediately shared her conclusion. With uncanny accuracy, she guessed that the negotiation involved a forced marriage. Realizing that Floor's innocent act hit an unexpectedly sharp mind, Shiryu lightly smacked her on the head and told the nosy gossip to back off. The atmosphere turned even heavier when Merida grabbed Shiryu's arm, demanding a place to stay while waiting for the agreed deadline. Floor immediately protested, trying to pull him toward her instead, but it was Rina who put an end to the tug-of-war. Gripping Shiryu's other arm tightly, she stood her ground and declared that he would never be sold like merchandise at the altar. If their financial crisis was truly the problem, she would sacrifice the most precious relic left behind by her late mother before accepting such extortion. Shiryu tried to calm Rina down while cutting through Floor's gossip. He assured her that the merchant would eventually provide the money, even if they had to swallow the interest rates in the end. But Rina refused to back down. With a firm hand on his arm, she bluntly declared, with unmistakable possessiveness, that both her territory and Shiryu were equally valuable. No one would ever use him as bargaining material. With the line firmly drawn, Shiryu shifted everyone's attention and fired up the witches gathered in the hall, challenging them to create a miraculous fertilizer and become true goddesses of the harvest. Far away, the political chess match continued. Sia handed over Shiryu's every move to Evely, who immediately wondered whether the price for that information would be the secrets behind the goddess's trial. Sia dismissed the idea, saying the leak was simply a gesture of respect, acknowledging the royal obligations that had once forced Evely into the choices she had made. The investigation into the goddess's trial had barely begun, but Evely revealed an important clue. The site where the trial had taken place was stained by the remnants of an ancient war. She then issued a serious warning. Sia's growing obsession with the poorest region in the kingdom had already caught the attention of both the first princess and the second princess. Smirking, Sia replied that watching the empire's worst corner descend into chaos was far more entertaining than her sister's pathetic struggle for the throne. With a deadly smile, Evely promised she would pass along that mocking remark to the princesses someday before cutting off the communication. What Sia never realized was that the second princess had been present the entire time, listening to every word from the shadows. As silence filled the room, Evely fixed her gaze on the royal and demanded her verdict on everything she had just heard. "I bet," the second princess and Sia's sister answered without hesitation. Before sitting down to play the game, she said, a player needed pieces on the board. Sia had always been nothing more than a spectator, but now she was marching toward control of the game itself. Evely agreed with the assessment, though she hinted that fate itself might be the one moving the pieces. Far away from the royal intrigue, Shiryu was boiling a purple substance inside a large cauldron. A mischievous grin spread across his face. He knew that once he extracted the oil from the mixture, it would take only 3 days before the witches were begging for even a few drops. He finished the process under Rina's watchful eyes while Floor and Hinless collapsed in the corner of the room, completely exhausted after harvesting an enormous pile of sunflower seeds. After bottling the goo and attaching a dispenser, Shiryu unveiled his secret weapon, a common product from his homeland called shower gel. He confidently declared that this invention would drain every last coin from Merida's pockets. Floor immediately frowned, convinced that no noble would ever rub plant slime all over their body. Shiryu simply told her to be patient and wait for the results. Their anticipation was interrupted by a villager announcing that Esther had returned and was waiting in the workshop. Shiryu couldn't understand what invisible force kept drawing trouble back to his town. While she waited, Esther vented her frustration. She complained to her traveling companion about how much she hated the texture of that strange material and mocked the overwhelming smell of poverty hanging in the air. Her companion, a witch obsessed with alchemy, paid no attention to the complaints. Fascinated, she carefully examined the sample, trying to determine whether the source of the anomaly was hidden within the soil of that forgotten land. The witch's obsession with her research made her completely oblivious to everything around her. Esther nearly lost her voice trying to get her attention, but the girl remained mesmerized by the experiment. The trance finally ended when Shiryu and the rest of his team walked through the door. Putting on her best diplomatic smile, Esther approached Rina to ask for a favor. Her speech was carefully prepared. She claimed that Oboga possessed rich farmland but an overly complacent population, and used that as an excuse to propose an agricultural exchange so her people could learn more about soil purification. Rina accepted the proposal immediately. Deep down, however, Shiryu knew that Esther's kindness concealed a blade. If they rejected her offer, she would not hesitate to release the parasitic slimes and devastate Emerald City's resources. While the negotiations continued, Floor carefully studied the visiting researcher. She quickly recognized her as Chelina, the heir to one of the kingdom's elite alchemist bloodlines, famous for combining lightning magic with matter manipulation. To Shiryu, that was nothing short of hitting the jackpot. A lightning specialist was exactly the kind of expert he needed to bring his future inventions to life. Esther's assistant immediately saw through the plan and quietly whispered that the boy intended to use them as tools, just as he had done with the creatures. She was quickly cut off by her mistress. Keeping up the act, Esther assured them that the partnership would be an excellent learning opportunity. Chelina simply nodded in silence, but Shiryu caught her real objective. He noticed her eyes lingering on a jar containing a valuable mineral inside his workshop. To bring the conversation to an end and get rid of the distraction, Shiryu handed the role of host over to Floor, using the visitor's long journey as the perfect excuse. Floor bought the act and promised to make the guests as comfortable as possible, but everyone knew the real goal was to isolate the newcomers as quickly as they could and get back to what truly mattered. Esther immediately realized she was being ushered out. Meanwhile, Floor's business-minded brain was working overtime. If the people of Oboga were swimming in money, then their ladies' vaults had to be overflowing with gold. If the redhead refused the loan, that visitor's fortune would make the perfect backup plan. Shiryu could only hope the gossip-loving witch would focus on keeping a close eye on the intruders instead of creating even more trouble. With the distractions finally out of the way, he gave Rina the signal. It was time to get to work. Far from the workshop, Hinless sought out Merida to deliver shocking news. Chelina had arrived. Merida didn't even blink before laying out the woman's entire history. The alchemist's reputation had been ruined, her laboratory destroyed, and she was drowning in debt. But the real danger ran much deeper. Chelina wasn't just another agent from Oboga, she was a spy who answered directly to the second princess. The revelation made Hinless want to run off and warn Shiryu immediately, but but Merida stopped her in her tracks. The redhead mocked the situation, reminding her that her former employee had never acted so impulsively before, and found it amusing that a man had pushed her into such a panic. Hinless blushed but held her ground. She firmly denied having any romantic feelings. All she wanted was to see Shiryu and Rina succeed because she truly believed the two of them had the power to fix their broken world. While conspiracies unfolded behind the scenes, Rina tested the new invention. The shower gel worked instantly. It quickly produced a rich lather, filling the room with the fresh scent of roses and nature. The product performed exactly as intended, cleaning effectively while leaving behind a pleasant fragrance. It was everything Shiryu had hoped for, proving that his latest invention had all the makings of a huge commercial success.